Channel. I'm your host, John Rees. Tonight, we bring you a comprehensive review of the UK elections as we reflect on potential outcomes, delve into the latest developments and provide insightful analysis. Throughout our coverage, we'll be joined by a distinguished panel, including journalist and the Islam Channel's very own Chris Banbury, along with political commentator Wasif Mahmood and various other guests who will offer perspectives on the election results and what they mean for the future of Britain. On the ground, we also have our senior political correspondent, Maz Patel, at various constituencies throughout the capital, providing us with updates as and when we need them. We'll revisit key moments and outcomes from the election, examining how they may shape the political landscape moving forward. Stay with the Islam Channel as we continue to bring you updates and in-depth discussions on the aftermath of this significant election. Thank you for joining us and trusting the Islam Channel with your post-election coverage. And it is just about post-election coverage. We haven't yet had the exit polls. We'll bring them to you as soon as we have them. But I'm now going to turn to my guests, Chris Banbury and Wasif Mahmood. And what do you expect, Chris?
We do have a BBC exit poll,
Go on,
which shows Labour with 410 seats, Conservative 131. And then after that, I think I wouldn't take too much faith in what the predictions are for the various smaller parties, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I don't think it's a big surprise that the Labour are going to win with a thumping majority. I think what will be interesting in the evening is the first results are going to come from safe Labour seats in the northeast of England, in Sunderland and in Blyth. I think the turnout there will be interesting. How much Sir Keir Starmer has motivated traditional working class voters to turn out for him. And I think for Islam Channel viewers, the devil is going to be in the detail this evening. I think all of us will be interested to see what the result in Islington North. That's not going to be for some time, whether Jeremy Corbyn can hold on. How much some of the smaller parties are going to do, the SNP, Plaid and the Greens. If they do well, and I don't put much faith in the figures for here, because I don't think they're telling the actual. That means Starmer is going to have a group to his left on issues like Gaza from the beginning.
OK, just let me bring in one other part of this exit poll, though. They're predicting 13 seats for Reform UK. That looks, Wasif, that looks very high.
It does look high, but then so does this vote for the Conservatives. I think it all comes down to how the Conservatives are going to actually fare here, because that really is the litmus test. We've got one exit poll showing predictions of a high number of seats of 187, predicted seats at 38, and a low number of seats of 30 for the Conservatives. This is from 376 that they currently hold. So the divergence here is what really is going to be a telling sign. And where reform is concerned, that's really going to be something where they're going to pick up their votes. So it's, well, where one person falls, another person rises, and this is where we're seeing similar situation with UKIP when they were around back in the 2015.
And so it's looking as if Labour's going to get the upper end of the possible majorities. 210, I think you said. YouGov was predicting 212 overall majority. But it's also looking like that is going to be, as was feared, it was going to be something like 38% of the vote, I think. So lower than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017.
This is the point I'm trying to make about turnout. I mean, the prediction is, and this is a fairly good prediction, is that this will be the lowest share of the vote that both Labour and the Conservatives have had since 1918, which was really the first time Labour had a national challenge in an election. So for that vote, for Labour to get a landslide majority with what looks to be a third of the vote, it's going to open up questions about electoral reform, because this one past the post system is no longer functioning in 2024.
So we'll see. What do you make of this? Because I mean, this is in some ways this is the most important story of the night. A whacking great big parliamentary majority on quite a low percentage of the vote for Labour. So an ability to govern, but not the legitimacy to govern, some might say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the tyranny of the majority of the minority in some ways, but what we are seeing is that majority here is something that if we go back to the 97 election, it was something similar in terms of the number of people that actually turned out to vote in the 97 election was not necessarily what people would predict as giving you that massive swing and that massive majority towards Labour in 1997. And so in a similar vein, what we're seeing here is people's apathy, more than anything else, it's people's apathy in relation to what's happened to politics. And that really is a concern, because if there's no engagement, as we're seeing, with 1/3 of the people turning out to vote, that really is a concern, because if you look across the channel with France, there was a massive increase in the number of people that took part in their elections, and yet that came out, well, we know what's happened over there as well. So we have to balance this up with what it is that we're actually engaging people with.
And if I may, I mean, yesterday a YouGov poll showed that the overwhelming reason why people were going to vote Labour was to get the Tories out. When it came down to things like supporting Keir Starmer, supporting the policies, it was down to 2% of those in polls saying this is why they were going to vote Labour. And I think there is a difference in 1997, which I can remember. I mean, Tony Blair is obviously now remembered for Iraq, but back in 1997, there were some expectations. They were going to deliver the Sure Start child programme. They were going to deliver a minimum wage, devolution in Scotland and Wales, elected monarchy. There were certain things on offer. All through this campaign, Keir Starmer has basically said, we're going to hold down spending and the consequence is austerity. This is going to be austerity light, possibly compared with the Tories, but it's going to be austerity. And I think this is not a great recipe for Sir Keir Starmer coming into government and faced with a number of issues from Gaza and domestically, which are going to be stacking up against him. And as I mentioned, the possibility of a troublesome cohort to his left on the backbenches, and incidentally as well, a landslide majority for Labour like this probably means that some candidates will sneak through who weren't properly vetted. So potentially a few more troublemakers might get through the vetting process here for seats that they weren't supposed to win.
I mean, we'll have to unpack this a bit as we go through the evening, but the 131 seats projected for the Tories, that's actually not as bad as some of the worst projections. For instance, the YouGov poll yesterday, which was suggesting that they were going to get 106, maybe even below 100 seats. So, I mean, there's something actually in the exit poll that doesn't stack up, because it doesn't stack up that Labour is going to get an overall majority of the scale that's being predicted, that the Tories are going to get a better than projected figure, that Reform UK are going to get a better than projected figure. Where's the difference coming from? Maybe the Liberal Democrats were overestimated in some of the before the election polling?
I think the strategy here is hope for the best, prepare for the worst in terms of the Conservative Party. It really is. Where you've got these predictions, and we've got predictions on the screen showing a low number of seats of being 30. I mean, that's ridiculous, but that's what people are actually predicting here. An actual prediction of about 78 and a high of about 187. So there is that variation. I think one thing that people are really concerned about is this idea that we are not actually we used to be a three-party system, then we were a two-party system, but actually we're a one-party system, but that one party is actually just shared between those two single parties because of the type of election system we have in this country, first past the post. And what you were talking about earlier in relation to, in 97, there was a clear demarcation of policies. This is the key issue. The fact that there's no clear demarcation of what is one party's policy compared to another. It's tinkering at the edges. And that is the real issue here, because the electorate doesn't know really what is an alternative choice, what is a radical choice beyond what Jeremy Corbyn was giving us in 2019, because that really was a radical choice. And everyone kind of curled up into their shell and said no to that. But by the same token, what we have today, I can't really tell you what was the real difference between those particular parties. And so that's what is going to be a concern.
I mean, the two polls are indicating Reform winning 7 to 13 seats. Now,
that's a big difference.
There's a big difference, but let's see. But that is not enough to eclipse the Conservative Party, which is what some people were talking about, was that Reform were going to do, Nigel Farage is going to do for the Conservatives. The Conservatives will survive this election. They're not going to be driven to extinction. There's going to be exciting information. I mean, whether Rishi Sunak holds on to his seat becoming the first Prime Minister, I think, since the war, who'd lose a seat in a general election. I mean, that's going to be interesting. But I think, the talk of the Conservative Party's death is premature. And let's see it. I think the further down you go, I think the figures for Reform, SNP, Plaid Cymru and Green are really up for grabs. I don't think, for all sorts of reasons, they can't really predict how this is going to turn out. So it's going to be an interesting evening. We won't know what happens in Northern Ireland until Friday, Saturday, which again is a completely different election.
Yeah.
Well, also, Chris, I mean, the Scottish election's a very different election now. How do you see that falling out?
Well, the latest polls this morning showed that the SNP had overhauled Labour in the public opinion polls, and that's because they switched their campaign to focusing on being anti-austerity and attacking Starmer for being pro-austerity. So we'll see how that turns out. But I mean, Scotland ceased to be a two-party electoral system a long time ago. And again, I think whatever the results for the SNP, I don't think they're going to be driven to extinction either. So I mean, I think there's, we'll look at these results as they come in.
Because surely a chunk of the Labour ascendancy depends on beating the SNP more fully, at any rate, having a vote in Scotland than they've had for a long time.
Well, I don't think Starmer doesn't need Scotland to win a majority. He's going to win the majority in England and Wales anyway. But I think what is interesting is that the SNP. The difficulty the SNP have had is having a really unremarkable period in government in recent years, and having gone through the Nicola Sturgeon scandal, that they are not motivating the working class support. And we should remember it was overwhelmingly a working class vote in 2014 for independence. So they're not motivating for that. So in a sense, it's going to be, a point we're making, a voter apathy, maybe what it does for the SNP here. It's not going to be some huge increase in the Labour vote. They're going to win back seats in the central belt in Glasgow and the West and so on. But I, for one, think we're not going to see, as I say, the extinction of the SNP, which is what a number of the British media, the London-based media, were kind of gleefully predicting.
So, 410 Labour seats being predicted by Sky. Again, that's pretty much in line with 23 in the other capacity. Well, that could be a great deal of different things. But all the headlines, at any rate for the Labour majority now, are pretty much in line with the predictions in the YouGov poll yesterday. What we're looking at is what's happening elsewhere in the election, really. And I've been saying all the way through this election, there's really three separate elections going on. There's an election in the centre, which is the Tory Labour election. There's an election on the left with an unprecedented number of independents and insurgency from the Greens, and then there's an election on the right, which is the competition between Reform UK and the Tory party. Now, I think what we know from the exit polls is how the election in the centre has done. What's a lot less clear to me is how the election on either ends of the spectrum is doing.
I think one of the interesting areas that we haven't actually discussed or actually picked up on is one thing in terms of how the constituencies are actually made up now, because one of the reasons why Conservatives will survive as well is because of the fact that there has been gerrymandering that has been done between the last election and now. And so there has been a clever ploy to understand exactly where different people are living, understanding the consensus that's come out, and then basically putting in place the right target audience for you to at least get what you need to get. And I think that's always been the case with parties in power. They've always done that. What they didn't protect was what happened with Gaza. And I think this is the key issue, because where they changed those boundary lines, they've actually helped a number of different constituencies, especially, for example, Ilford North, where there was a change in that boundary line that has now made someone like West Streeting very vulnerable. And I think that's something that we also have to pick up on, is this recent surge that when you're in power from 2019 and you're thinking about what you're going to be doing, and then all of a sudden a mass impact event happens, such as Gaza, which then turns the tables of how you're actually meant to be doing things, and it puts everything out of sync and out of centre. So that, I think, is going to be quite an important factor, because I think from that exit poll that we saw, where 23 others are coming in, that's going to be an important factor, I think.
Chris, what's in the others bag?
The other bag, I think, at the moment, the polls show the Conservatives winning 5 seats from the SNP, including the Stephen Flynn's seat in Aberdeen. So I don't see that happening. So I think the others bag is going to be potential independents. George Galloway in Rochdale, will he hold that seat? That's another question we could look out for. Northern Ireland, of course, will be contributing completely different results, so that's quite a lot of that bag. If I may say, there's 2 points I'd make about this. Labour tonight, so Keir Starmer is actually, if these predictions are correct, its majority is going to be less than that of Tony Blair in 1997. Secondly, he's achieved this on a smaller share of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn achieved in 2017. So Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, standing on a left-wing platform, got a higher percentage of the vote than Sir Keir Starmer did tonight, which is a sobering thought.
So that's an astounding. That's an astounding thing, isn't it? And all that depends on. So it's very clear that Corbyn, especially the bad result of 2019, was an exceptional circumstance produced by the Brexit vote, and nothing more or less about than that. And virtually, really, what it says is that anybody who'd been leading the Labour Party, if they'd adopted those policies, would have ended up in a similar place.
I think it's a little bit unfair as well on Jeremy Corbyn, though, because we've seen as well the way in which there were a number of external factors to how Jeremy Corbyn was treated, even to this point where you've got an ex-leader of the party that's actually been ousted from that particular party, where there's been reports that have taken place. We need to understand the kind of smaller dynamics that were being played on a micro level that have resulted in these kind of macro changes with Jeremy Corbyn. It wasn't just a case of Keir Starmer having, as we have here, the full support of everyone, and he was basically battling from behind and from the front, and that was a real difference. I think it's important to give Jeremy Corbyn the credit where credit's due over there. But with Keir Starmer, it really, again, it just points to that point of apathy. There is nothing new. 1997, we've got D-Ream coming up, things will only get better. You've got people dancing on the streets saying, this is the end. And this was at a time when, remember, the economy was booming. Remember, that was the campaign slogan from the Conservatives. Britain's booming, don't let Labour spoil it. That was the campaign at the time. We're in a completely different territory in relation to that. So it's very important to understand those little nuances, I think.
So, Chris, if Reform do get even the lower end of those projections, if they get 7 seats, that's double what the YouGov poll said, I think. I think they said 3 yesterday. So that will put some pressure on the Tories, even though they've done slightly better than the completely disastrous scenario that it might have been.
It will put some pressure on the Tories, and I don't think they need any more encouragement. We've already had Steve Baker, who's one of the key Brexiteers, saying that if he's returned in High Wycombe, which that's I might say, he will be standing for the Tory leadership. Suella Braverman is making noise. She can't contest it, but she's saying, she's gearing up. So this will force the Tories rightwards, but it's also going to force Starmer on issues like migration rightwards. He's going to be watching his right. And we should be looking, when these results do start coming in, particularly for what the so-called red belt seats,
I think we're going to have a look at a minute.
Reform is done in Labour seats.
I think we're going to have a look at the graphic about the Reform. This is John Curtis, who is one of the more reliable pollsters out there, saying that Reform may win more seats than expected. So he's kind of going along with the drift of that exit poll. So I don't know what the vote share is going to look like. The vote share is probably going to be, I don't know, what, 15-16%. The Tories will probably be, they're getting that kind of figure, maybe they'll be in the low 20s somewhere. It's going to look as if there are 2 parties on the political right, not just one.
What it's saying here is Reform, what John Curtis is saying is Reform is doing well in areas which voted Leave in 2016, which is not a surprise.
Yeah.
But that isn't just Tory seats. That's also Labour seats in huge chunks of Northern England and the Midlands. Seats which voted Tory last time because Labour committed itself to a second referendum and Brexit disastrously. Keir Starmer responsible for that, though he hides that fact now today. So, as I'm saying, it'll be interesting to see how reform is polling in seats like that, which Labour are going to probably take back, but reform could still do quite well, and that will put pressure on Starmer, and he'll be looking over his shoulder on issues like migration, where the reform have been. Certainly the week I got was focused entirely on immigration.
So we'll see if that means essentially that there's going to be, as I say, two Conservative parties, and what Chris is really saying is that in some Labour seats, the challenge that they're facing from the Conservative Party will be the Conservative Party that is reform, not the Conservative Party that is the Conservative Party.
Well, this is the point. I think what we're going to learn tonight is what has been an adage throughout history, which is lies, lies and statistics. I think the point is going to be made tonight in relation to all of these exit polls and how they come together. But one of the things that I think is quite important as well is this a potential time for a shift towards proportional representation, because of the fact that there's some of these, like you said, on the left, there's two types of left. In the centre, there's two types of centre. On the right, there's two types of centre. We're starting to get nuances on those particular sides, as opposed to the traditional left-right, which forced through, and we understood why first past the post was good. But I think this might be a case at some point for people to start thinking in the long term why we would do this.
We're about 5 minutes out from a break, but before we do that, let's have a look at Ed Davey responding to the Liberal the results the Liberal Party have had. I think he's described these as the best in a generation. Now, given the generation that the Lib Dems have had since the coalition, I'm not sure that's an absolutely huge claim. It'll be quite a remarkable relationship between the campaign that the Liberal Democrats have run and the result that they get, won't it? Because, I mean, nobody could have missed the fact that Ed Davey seemed to be confused about whether he was running in the election or participating in It's a Knockout. What does it say about the electorate that after being exposed to relentless stunts, they're voting more than ever for the Liberal Democrats?
But where are they voting for the Liberal Democrats? The answer is they're voting in seats which the Liberal Democrats are winning from the Conservatives. So again, it's a shift within the centre.
It's an anti-Tory vote.
Yeah, the Tory vote is collapsing here. Now, it's not going to make, as we were saying, it's not to the point of extinction, but it's going to reform and it's going to the Liberal Democrats.
Well, really, we'll see if the vote's going to absolutely everybody, isn't it? The Tory vote. I mean, it's such a collapse. It's gone to Labour, it's gone to Reform, it's gone to the Liberal Democrats. I mean, frankly, if there were a donkey standing, it'd get the Tory vote.
It seems a total loss of confidence and trust in the Conservative Party across the board. And so if you're looking at some of those Liberal Democrat seats, these were some of the seats that they'd won in 2010 as well. So they're going back to those particular old haunting grounds as to where they want to win those particular seats. I think with the Liberal Democrats, in some ways it's like a safe vote for a lot of people as well. And they say, OK, we know what they're about. It's the forgiving of the Liberal Democrats that's the real issue. It's because, especially with the youth,
after the coalition,
because people remember that, you know what, it wasn't just 14 years of Conservatives, it was also the Liberal Democrats that were part and parcel of that particular horror show. No.
Okay, we've got Keir Starmer's reaction on Twitter now to the exit poll. Obviously, very pleased with the result. Doesn't have anything to say about the vote share, perhaps predictably enough. Yeah, so I mean, Labour obviously are going to have one hell of a party tonight, aren't they?
They're going to have a big party, and for the Tories, this is the smallest share of seats in the House of Commons since the Tory party came into existence. The Conservative and Unionist Party came into existence.
So that's since 1834.
Well, I think actually we date it back to the 1860s, and when they formed with
the Whigs?
then they were the Tories, then they became the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Yeah.
But it's a fairly disastrous night for them, and it will make things more difficult for them recovery because it also will affect their funding. They've lost funding when Labour have got the biggest private donations, but also this means they'll lose funding in terms of the whole electoral system at Westminster.
So it looks like Sunak's going to hold his seat, according to predictions.
He may well hold his seat, but
Is
whether or not he...
is that the best outcome that he could hope for?
Is he going to stay? Is he going to leave? I suppose the issue is going to be whether or not he goes off to California, because that's really what a lot of people have been predicting. He's going to retire.
School term starts early in the United States.
There you go.
Yep. May have to get the kids into.
I mean, I think
just before we go back, we're just going to go to the break. But I just want to mention one thing, because just before the exit poll came out, we had results for the other house, for the House of Lords, the outgoing nominations or whatever they're called. Margaret Hodge, one of them. Wasif?
Well, I don't know what to say to that, to be honest with you. It's one of those things where we've had someone that has, I suppose, towed the party line quite heavily, but we all, and the Islam Channel especially, some of the comments that we've had in the past, we all remember what happened under the Jeremy Corbyn campaign and how she went after Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that there is, at least from the people that are in her area, because it's Barking and Dagenham, effectively, they really do have, I'd say, they have some sort of concern with regards to how someone like that ends up now in the House of Lords.
Yeah, well, I think there are very few people who were prominent in the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn who haven't made it into the House of Lords, Ian Austin and others. And that brings us to the conclusion of the first part of our election coverage. We'll, of course, be back after the break to analyse more of the results and to keep an eye on the constituency results as they come in. And I'll be joined, as I am now, by my guests, Chris Banbury and Wasif Mahmood. But do rejoin us after this break.
Muslims, we are, by definition, hard-working people.
Five Pillars is not just any ordinary game show. It's a unique platform to deepen our understanding of Islam and strengthen our connection with our faith.
I'm going to win.
50 points. Give that to me.
Oh my God, I don't know.
Pass. Pass as well.
The losing team out that way.
Islam Channel, your gateway to the world of Islam. Inspiring, informing, entertaining. On TV, online, on our brand new state-of-the-art apps. With original content for a Muslim audience and inspirational Islamic programs from all around the Muslim world. Watch live, watch offline, create your playlist, watch across all devices. Download now from wherever you usually get your apps. Islam Channel. Watch anytime, anywhere.
Five Pillars is not just any ordinary game show. It's a unique platform to deepen our understanding of Islam and strengthen our connection with our faith.
I'm going to win.
50 points. Give that to me.
Oh my God, I don't know.
Pass. Pass as well.
The losing team out that way.
Islam Channel, your gateway to the world of Islam. Inspiring, informing, entertaining. On TV, online, on our brand new state-of-the-art apps. With original content for a Muslim audience and inspirational Islamic programs from all around the Muslim world. Watch live, watch offline, create your playlist, watch across all devices. Download now from wherever you usually get your apps. Islam Channel. Watch anytime, anywhere. Islam Channel, your gateway to the world of Islam. Inspiring, informing, entertaining. On TV, online, on our brand new state-of-the-art apps. With original content for a Muslim audience and inspirational Islamic programs from all around the Muslim world. Watch live, watch offline, create your playlist, watch across all devices. Download now from wherever you usually get your apps. Islam Channel. Watch anytime, anywhere.
هذا فتى قريش ومصارعه وفارس وسفيرها ولسانها إذا نافق.
أنت يا علي احرص على محمد أكثر من حرصك على نفسك.
فمن كان على أمر من أمور المسلمين فليتق الله فيهم.
This Adhan is brought to you by Orphans in Need, bringing hope for a better tomorrow.
عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: إذا سمعتم النداء فقولوا مثل ما يقول المؤذن.
On the authority of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, whenever you hear the adhan, say as the mu'adhin is saying.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
O Allah, owner of this perfect call and owner of this prayer to be performed, bestow upon Muhammad al-Wasila and al-Fadila and send him upon a praised platform which you have promised him. Verily, you never fail in your promise.
This Adhan is brought to you by Orphans in Need, bringing hope for a better tomorrow.
Were that he'd have over 200 seats majority, looks like more like 170. Perhaps a slightly better night for the Conservatives with 131 seats. There were some polls that were showing them just over 100 or even just below 100. Lib Dems have had a revival after being punished by the electorate for their part in the Tory Liberal Democrat coalition. They're back up with 61 seats. Perhaps the most surprising and maybe less believable result, 13 seats predicted for Reform UK, much higher than any of the previous predictions. We'll see if that's borne out by the actual results. I've had a bit of a report of the result in Islington North, well, a kind of non-report actually, because it's saying that it's too close to call. That's the contest, of course, between Jeremy Corbyn and the nominee of the Labour Party in that seat. In Keir Starmer's Holborn and St Pancras seat, It looks as if the leader of the Labour Party has, of course, been returned, but it looks as if Andrew Feinstein, the independent candidate, has done well, and also as if there's a significant reform vote in that constituency as well. Now, those are just rumours from people at the count, but we'll know later in the evening, actually much later in the evening, whether or not those rumours are true. But now let me turn to my two guests, Chris Banbury and Wasif Mahmood, to talk about what the results mean. So we've had a bit of time to digest them. Wasif, overall, what have you got to say?
I mean, I think what we thought is going to happen is happening in relation to Labour, so we know that. So the bigger macro picture has not changed. But I think what is interesting, I suppose, is the way in which some of the votes for the independents that are coming in, they are going to be quite interesting, because these are the votes that where you'd otherwise expect Labour to have large majorities with some of their seats. You know, we have constituencies like in East Ham where there's a 26,000 majority, or you have Ilford North. All of those particular areas, they seem to have seen a significant drop in that particular Labour vote, and that is what's going to be quite interesting, because that's, for a lot of people, something to build on in the future. Because they know that there is that apathy and there is that kind of change. So we will kind of knuckle down into what this means as it goes along. But I don't think it's all, roses and smiles for the Labour Party, because there's a lot of apathy that they have to deal with, especially at the next election. So, they'll be given a chance.
I mean, I don't want to be a party pooper, but I've said repeatedly that I think the only independent candidate that has a chance of getting elected will be Jeremy Corbyn. That doesn't mean, I think, good votes for people like Andrew Feinstein, Michael Lavitt, the candidate in Birmingham Wade, these are going to be very important. But they cannot win because of the first past the post system, because they are fresh parties or fresh challenges to an established Labour Party. It's almost impossible for them to win in that situation. But I think you're correct. I think a good vote, and that means saving your deposit, gives something to build upon, and it will give confidence to people campaigning on issues like Palestine to continue that with a Keir Starmer government. And we've already seen Starmer seemingly promise he would recognise the Palestinian state, but then adding only if Israel is safe and secure, essentially Israel agrees to that, which is never going to happen. So there are issues there. I mean, British arms sales to Israel. I mean, already you can see demands that could come from people like that. So, as I said before, the devil's in detail. I think it's also going to be a night of some fun watching Tory cabinet ministers getting beaten. For those who remember 1997, the sweetest moment was when Michael Portillo lost in Enfield. We already have an indication here that Steve Baker, who I mentioned, was positioning himself to challenge for the Tory leadership, has got supposedly just a 1% chance of retaining his seat in Wickham. Now, that's Steve Baker gone. There's going to be more like this tonight of Tories. So I think we can have some fun around watching Tory cabinet ministers getting their comeuppance.
Although it looks as if, Sunak looks as if he's going to hold his seat. And on these figures, Kemi Badenoch, which is not unimportant because she's going to be very likely one of the challengers for the leadership of the Tory party. But before we move back to the right wing, let's just pursue that discussion about the independents, because this was an election in which there was a huge number of independents standing. There's an old cliche about people standing for election. They say they're throwing their hat in the ring. Well, in some of these constituencies, you could have opened a hat shop with the number of hats in the ring. Did that make any real difference? I mean, in constituency after constituency, there's perhaps one independent who's emerged as the most credible figure, but there are also a whole number of other independents on the ballot. You feel sorry for the electors because there's no way of distinguishing between them when you just walk into the ballot box. Is that something that needs to get sorted out down the road?
I think part and parcel of this is also how quickly the election was announced. A lot of people were gearing towards a November election, and so a lot of people had their campaign thought processes, their procedures geared towards something along those lines, whether that also included discussions with other people. I mean, I know, for example, in Bethnal Green, there was Mr. Kunji and Mr. The candidate that ended up standing. They both made an agreement for one to step aside. But effectively, the killing of the vote is really coming from other areas where basically people have not necessarily given us a single candidate for those particular constituencies. I think it's down to the fact that the election was called very early, but also down to the fact that people have not really got over those egos to be able to get over that line.
Okay, well, look, we've got a chance now to have a chat with our senior political correspondent, Maz Patel. He's out in the Redbridge constituency at Redbridge Town Hall. Maz, what's life looking like in Redbridge at the moment?
Well, looking around me, John, it's positively peaceful and quiet, actually. I can't see just a few people going home, doing their business. But we're outside Redbridge Town Hall. The count's actually not taking place here, John. I think we've just, obviously here just to give it a focal point, because Redbridge has been in the news.
Yeah, well, tell us about the contest there.
Well, I can tell you, I've just been looking at my feed coming in. The BBC are reporting that West Streeting actually makes it. He is going to be re-elected. But there has been a strong challenge, that's their words, a strong challenge from the left. And sorry, this is a bit of feedback that I'm hearing. Sorry, John, there's been a strong challenge from the left. That's what the BBC have said. And as a result of that, it'll be interesting to know exactly how many votes they secure.
Well, thanks very much, Maz. Thanks for bringing us that initial report from Redbridge. I mean, Chris, that's an example of what we were saying before, and as you were saying, as we've heard about Holborn and St Pancras, it looks like they're quite strong challenges from the left. That's the kind of initial word.
I think there's a difference between some of these independent candidates. I think we've seen candidates, as in Redbridge, Ilford North. Rian Mohammed is not just campaigning on Palestine. She's campaigning on NHS privatisation. West Streeting is the shadow health secretary. She's campaigning on austerity. That's similar to Ahmed Yaqub in Birmingham Ladywood, Andrew Feinstein, you just mentioned, Michael Lavalette in Preston. I think if you just focus on Palestine, this isn't a by-election, this is a general election. So there's a difference from, with George Galloway in Rochdale, which is a by-election. If you just focus on Palestine, I don't think you can cut the mustard. I think where candidates like Leanne and so on are focusing on a much wider agenda, I think they're going to get strong votes, which can lay the foundation for something going into the future. And I think, that needs to be assessed. And we need to look at places like, as you mentioned, Bethel Green, where we haven't had that sort of candidacy, to be quite honest, that there needs to be some reflection on why that wasn't the case.
Yeah. I mean,
but just to hang on a minute, because I think we can go back to Maz, because we've got that link back up again. Maz, can you hear us more clearly now?
Much more clearly. I think we've managed to sort out the feedback issue.
Good. So back to that discussion then. You were saying Labour going to get it, but they're going to be facing a relatively strong left challenge, yes?
Yeah, that's what the opinion polls are picking up when they did the exit polling in this particular constituency. Obviously, the BBC, they do an exit poll for every single constituency. For the benefit of our viewers, an exit poll is, maybe you were asked today as well, as you walk out, do you mind telling us who you voted for? Many people don't actually mind telling, certainly the BBC, or indicating who they voted for in complete confidence. And as a result of that, you've got that 170-seat majority showing at 10 o'clock, which is the announcement that comes from the BBC. It's a traditional thing now. And as part of that, they've obviously done Ilford North. Ilford North was one of the highlights of the other seats that the independents were challenging. Obviously, we've still got Islington North, which is even bigger. I mean, that is going to be huge. We're going to be going up there later on. But certainly in Redbridge, there were two challenges, one in Ilford South by Nurjahan Begum, one in Ilford North by Lian Mohammed. Both those challenges have been labelled as strong, however, not enough to turn the tide of this huge swing away from the Tories. And this is a big, big statement against the Conservative Party, against the Conservative government. Whether it's a mandate for Labour in the sense that they will use that mandate? Well, obviously, many will argue, well, people were simply fed up after 14 years, and anything better than the Tories would have done at this stage.
Well, of course, that is what the YouGov poll in the last couple of days showed, that 48% of Labour voters were voting simply to get the Tories out. I think only 5% of Labour voters said they were actually voting for Labour policies. So the people that are putting that argument, they've got a bit of evidence for it, haven't they?
They've got, absolutely, John. They've got a lot of evidence for it. One thing I will say, I was touring the constituencies myself to do a write-up for a piece later on tomorrow. I actually interviewed a lot of Muslims who were supporting Labour nationally. And I asked them what the reasons were, and they said, yes, Gaza, we feel for Gaza, but we want change from the Tories. Anything is better than the Tories. And I did challenge, I said, look, are you, what about the deaths and the genocide and all the issues that obviously we've been reporting on in the marches that are being raised? And the answer was simply yes, but, Starmer has been disappointing on Gaza, but not enough for us not to vote for Labour. Now, that's just a small sample. The majority that I actually polled in the Muslim community were saying, never Labour again. They're very, very passionate. A lot of them have voted, certainly in East London, which is where I was touring. And I think, John, where this is going to best manifest itself is going to be in the local elections, perhaps in 2 years' time. I don't think in a national poll, independence on this issue of Palestine, I heard the discussion about whether you can just run on Palestine. You certainly can't, because it's a national election, and even Muslim voters are quite sophisticated in that sense.
OK, Maz, of course we'll be returning to you throughout the evening as you tour the constituencies of the city and bring us the results and discussion of what the possibilities are right the way through the night. Thanks very much. Chris, let's just move the discussion on a little bit, because we haven't really looked at that figure that's up on the predictions for the SNP. 10 seats.
That would be a shocking result, and it would rebound very heavily on the SNP leadership, and particularly the former leader, Nicola Sturgeon, who I think would have to take much of the blame for this because of the scandal which engulfed, as I said, the SNP of the funding crisis. But I think also it reflects on a very fairly miserable few years in Scottish government, where it's adopted very much a neoliberal agenda. It hasn't demarcated itself as it did in the past from Labour, and I think the chickens are coming home to roost here. And I think also, supporters of independence really, it's been like the Grand Old Duke of York. The SNP keeps saying, John Swinney, the SNP, would have said in this election campaign, if we win a majority in this election, that's the green light for independence. Well, this is just nonsense. And people knew it was nonsense, and there was a growing frustration. There's no strategy. I must say that, just on one other thing, can I just say that Jeremy Hunt, it's been reported, has just 19% of a chance of retaining his seat in Godalming. That's the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yeah, there will be an amazing loss. I can't remember a time when a senior cabinet minister like that had lost their seat. There is going to be an endless stream of completely miserable stories for the Tories tonight. There's no other way of looking at it.
It is a complete reset, isn't it? Because what we're going to end up having is a whole lot of people thinking, right, this will be the next. We've geared and groomed this person to be the next prime minister, the next, minister for this or minister for that. And they're all going to be losing their seats left, right and centre. So there's going to be a real back to basics of what exactly is left in terms of the number of Conservative MPs to mount a credible challenge in 4 years' time. Well,
I think what's quite interesting, I'm looking at some of the reaction across Europe, and they're kind of contrasting Britain with, back to social democracy, Labour winning, they're contrasting it with events in France and elsewhere. Actually, if you look into these election results, it's not that different from Europe. The first past the post system masks it because Labour are getting a huge majority with a low percentage of the vote. But we are seeing a fragmentation of the vote here. And that is exactly what we're seeing across Europe and indeed in North America. And I think it's interesting, going back to, Sunak, he's going to hold his seat, but both Sunak and David Cameron kind of symbolise, I think, for many on the right, You were talking about Sunak going back to California. I think they symbolise for many on the right, the traditional Tory base, this idea of this sort of cosmopolitan, globalised character who can go to India, could go to the United States, he could go anywhere, and they resent this. And they resent Cameron's, as they resented Cameron, I think, as you saw with the Brexit referendum. So there's a disconnect between political leaders and the base. And I don't think Starmer is actually any better here. I think my experience is that no one was voting Labour out of enthusiasm for Keir Starmer. They were voting to get rid of the Tories because of mortgage increases, because it's not safe to drink the water in parts of this country, because there's raw sewage in our lakes and rivers. I mean, I can keep going through it. That's why they were voting Labour. But there was no enthusiasm for Starmer, and he's seen as being someone else, a posh bloke, a top lawyer, in a bubble, somewhat cut off from ordinary folk. So I think we shouldn't, fall for this idea that what's happening in Britain is that different from what we're seeing in North America, and United States, and Europe.
Well, see, though, is there one thing that sort of distinguishes the British electoral cycle, and that is that it seems to have fallen into, since Margaret Thatcher, extensive periods of Tory government, followed then by an extensive period, 3 elections of Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, followed by now what we just had, 14 years of Tory and Tory Lib Dem coalition. Unsafe to make predictions about the next election before we've had the results of this election in, but with a majority this big, there has to be at least some possibility that Labour would hold a second term. It's quite a strange electoral cycle, that, isn't it?
Well, what can we say? The British are sadomasochists. They really like to punish themselves. I suppose one of the issues that comes out of this is effectively we don't have a real system of holding account. That's really what the question is going to be, and it's that old adage: power corrupts absolute, power corrupts absolutely. And we saw that with the Tories with regards to how, the decadence with which they dealt with COVID. Remember, we have to recall the fact that, we had a situation where 100,000 deaths had taken place in a country. It's like we've almost forgotten that's taken place. There are going to be people that were affected by each one of those particular deaths. There are going to be people that are affected by seeing their local MPs, like it was just said, there's a complete disconnect. This idea that, I will give this money to my pals, I will give this particular thing to anyone else. Those kinds of issues are what you call chickens coming home to roost. But by the same token, what we have done, we've given the keys again, but are we giving the keys to the fox again, to another fox, to the hens? So this is the kind of issues that we have to really face up to. And first past the post, it is a very, very depressing system when we come to think about it in relation to keeping hold of politicians to account. Because how do we do that now? Because that's really the question.
If I could jump in, reports are coming in that Reform are likely to take Barnsley North and Barnsley South from Labour. And these are reports, so this is not a result, but also it seems like they might win in Hartlepool, which Labour lost to the Tories, one of those red wall seats in the last election, which voted Leave. Plus strong performances by Reform in Doncaster North, Easington, Rotherham and Bolsover. They're final mining communities.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not just Reform, it's potentially picking up votes and indeed seats from the Conservatives. They may be picking up from Labour in exactly those former industrial mining areas which have suffered so badly as a constituency and which voted solidly for Brexit.
I think one of the other things that we really have to think about is, as with Britain, as with any election, it's always the economy. It's the economy stupid kind of thing. And one of the things another report that's just come out is from, again, Sir John Curtis, who is very respected, who's turned around and said that the Liz Truss fiscal event is really hurting people because of the mortgage rises. So Middle England and the way it's been squeezed, that really is a concern as well, because of the fact that, again, we're talking about these events, they're once-in-a-generation events that have happened in the space of one parliament. You've had Brexit, you've had the fallout of Liz Truss's terrible, terrible policies, and on top of that, COVID as well. So all of those things combined together have resulted in what we're seeing today.
Let me just give you some of the changes in Labour's vote across regions in the UK. So up by 3% in the north, up by 4% in the Midlands, up by 2% in the south, down by 2% in London, up by 18% in Scotland, and down by 2% in Wales. Now, I mean, I guess one thing to be said about that is that the vote share is way, way below the increase in the number of seats, and that the biggest single thing is Scotland.
I mean, this is not really, I mean, just going through those figures, this is not sustainable. This is going to cause a debate, because to win a landslide like this on such a low percentage of the vote is really going to raise questions about our electoral system. And with people voting for different parties, which we've been talking about, with a fragmentation of the vote, that demand is going to come. But the big difference, I think, it could well be Scotland. I mean, that is fascinating that in London, which is a Labour stronghold now, the vote has actually fallen. That's an indication that the independents may have done well if that vote has fallen, because I don't see it going in London, that vote going to Reform, to the Liberal Democrats. I suspect it indicates that while Lamb, Mohammed and people are not going to win, they've got a decent vote.
Hopeful for Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
What will be interesting here is once they do these predictions, let's just, even if we were to get someone to do these predictions on the basis of a PR vote, how this would have planned out if there was a PR system within this country, based on the number of people voting, how they voted, and then putting that across into seats. That would be quite interesting, because I don't think that Labour will get anywhere near the 410, even with because of the way in which that particular system works. You'd actually have at least some challenge. It's just the lack of challenge that is really concerning right now.
I mean, many people, and amongst them, think that the PR would be a fairer voting system, but it wouldn't necessarily give you better results. I mean, the problem is, even on the first past the post, we're getting more PR-like results than we've had in the past. I'm not sure I'm not sure that further down the same road would be an improvement.
There is the idea that you get stronger government with first past the post because you get a strong majority, but then, how do you hold to account? That really is the question.
Okay, well, look, we've got a guest to join us now. She's Lindsay Taylor. She's the head of the community, head of community at MEND. That's the Muslim Engagement and Development, and a representative in Scotland for the Muslim vote. Welcome to the show, Lindsay. Just give us your first reactions to that exit poll.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I mean, it's surprising, the exit poll that we're seeing, definitely. I mean, we had a notion that Labour were going to win by a landslide, but it's seeming like quite a large landslide. Also, I'm based up here in Scotland, and we've been seeing for weeks and days that the SNP is looking like they're going to be losing more and more seats, but this is the first time that we've seen it this low, to be honest.
Are you surprised by that? Because 10, that would be pretty disastrous as a prediction for the SNP if it turns out to be true.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that is incredibly low. We were seeing earlier this week it coming back in the low 20s and then in the high teens, but 10 would be very disastrous for the SNP up here.
And what does that say about the prospects for independence? I mean, we were just discussing this on the programme and suggesting perhaps that the SNP had exhausted the independence carrot as an electoral motivator.
I mean, I think there's definitely lots of other things that are motivating individuals to vote. Currently, I think obviously Gaza and Palestine is something that's very important to people, and that's something that they're kind of thinking about when they're going to the polls. I think also the fact that we're living in such austerity just now obviously is motivating a lot of people just now. And I think also SNP has had a very large majority up here in Scotland for quite some time, and I think it's making people maybe think slightly differently because we are living in a cost of living crisis. But I think one of the big issues in Scotland is that people are not necessarily seeing the difference between Scottish Parliament and Westminster. So they're voting a bit differently than maybe you would want them to if they were kind of looking at things in a Westminster picture rather than a Scotland alone picture.
And what do you make of the Reform vote? There's a prediction there in the exit polls of 13 seats. I think that's almost double any pre-election prediction that we've seen.
I mean, I think especially when you think about some of the comments that Reform candidates and supporters have been coming out with in recent weeks, I think it's very concerning, the fact that party which has basically allowed its members to speak in such ways and to carry on in such ways. And we've also obviously seen Nigel Farage coming out and making comments which are not very supportive in any way whatsoever of the Muslim community. I think it is concerning that we're seeing a possibility of 13 seats going to Reform. Is there a Reform presence in Scotland? Yes, there is. There was actually. I was out in different polling stations today, but I was on groups where they were highlighting where people were at the polling stations and things, and there was even a presence at polling stations of Reform. So, Scottish politics going forward, it's going to be a significant difference from practically anything that's happened since the independence referendum. Is that your picture? I mean, it could look incredibly different, but I think one of the things to me is I was at polling stations today. I was canvassing yesterday. I don't know. I'm thinking that the exit polls are maybe edging on the side of caution a little bit too much. That maybe we're not going to see such a wipeout for the SNP. There is still a lot of support here for SNP, as there is for other parties as well. But there is still a lot of support here for SNP. But I do think tomorrow we are going to wake up to quite a different Scotland. But we do have the elections in 2026 coming up, and we need to think about those already, I think. And so would you expect those, supposing the polls right, relatively poor, perhaps actually historically quite poor results for the SNP, would you expect them to bleed over into that election in Scotland, or is this just a Westminster election phenomenon? Well, there's always a bit of a bleed over, but I think what it might happen instead is that the SNP take a look at themselves, see maybe where they've gone wrong, see the issues that have arisen, and maybe start to work on them on the ground in Scotland. They can definitely, in Scottish Parliament elections, look a lot more at just Scotland issues, look about issues that are specifically for the Scottish Parliament, and hopefully that would make a difference for them. Well, we're just being told that Nicola Sturgeon has said that it's not a good night for the SNP. She should know, shouldn't she? She's largely responsible for it not being that good a night. Well, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is just an MSP at this point. She's not an MP. She's not attached to Westminster. Yes, she is a former First Minister, but we do have a new First Minister in place now. Yes, possibly some of the kind of hangover from when she was First Minister could definitely be bleeding into the election polls that we're looking at tonight. But, you know, I was sitting with a member of an MP's staff team today, and she said, I'm worried because tomorrow I could be waking up and I'm unemployed. Tomorrow I'm waking up and I don't have a job. And I think that's what we've got to think about. I think SNP have to really think about their staff teams, about the MPs, who tomorrow potentially are waking up without jobs. Let me ask you a bit about what you think this election result might mean for the Muslim community, because we're going to have a kind of rump Tory party, likely dominated by the kind of politics that Suella Braverman or Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick represent. We're going to have whatever the exact result, a larger presence of Nigel Farage and Reform UK in the political system. We've got a Labour leader who has probably made the single most offensive remark towards an ethnic minority of any party leader at all during the election campaign. That's a darkening horizon, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, we've lived for quite some time with Islamophobia. We've had Well, we've lived for a very long time with Islamophobia, but especially in our politics, we've lived for a long time with Islamophobia. And unfortunately, it does look as though not much is changing. But what has changed is the Muslim community, and that's the important thing. The fact that in such a short time, the Muslim community, for the first time in a really long time across the UK, are galvanised. We are seeing in seats that are very Muslim heavy, there is a difference. Whether that means that it's a complete difference away from Labour or Conservatives or from other parties, what we're seeing is that people are motivated on the ground. People are working together. People are keen to get involved. This isn't about just this election. This is about the next 5 elections. This is about the next 10 elections. This is about showing political parties that Muslim voices and Muslim votes really count. And I think whether or not Labour wins by a landslide, whether or not we have reform, or whether or not SNP are losing by a landslide, I think what we can see is that the Muslim community are now working together and they're engaged in politics, and that's going to remain. And so political parties are going to have to engage with the Muslim community. They are going to have to listen to the concerns and the issues that Muslim people have, and they are going to actually start having to address these. So to me, even though it's looking like, we are still going to have a lot of issues around Islamophobia and racism and prejudice, that actually people are going to have to start taking the Muslim community seriously and have to start working with them.
Do you think going forward that there'll be a rather greater chance of a single candidate emerging to challenge the main parties? Because it's very heartening that so many independent candidates have stepped forward, but in quite a lot of constituencies they're competing against one another as well as against the main parties. Is there a mechanism? Is there a way? Can you see a project that might lessen that weakness or reduce that weakness?
Well, obviously independents have always had an issue in being elected, and that definitely is something. But we're seeing a new party kind of emerging. The Workers' Party has emerged this year. We're also seeing, obviously, Jeremy Corbyn standing as an independent and being really keen to move that forward. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw other independents who were either elected or were keen to stand in future elections coming behind, individuals of prominence who were independents and kind of moving that forward.
Okay. Well, that's very useful, very insightful discussion. Thanks very much to Lindsay Taylor there from MEND for joining us. Now, we turn to discussion in the studio. So, Chris, that's Nicola Sturgeon more or less accepting that this is the way it's going to go tonight for the SNP.
I have to say, firstly, if I was Nicola Sturgeon, I think I would get quiet, because I think she has to take a lot of responsibility for this, not just over the scandal around the financing, but also given her performance as First Minister, which hardly set the heather alight. So I think there's going to have to be, as was just said there by Lindsay, I think there's going to have to be some soul searching in the SNP about where they go from here. They desperately tried to tack left towards the end of the campaign, focusing on being anti-austerity, contrasting themselves with Labour and the Tories. But I think that was too little, too late. And as I've said, I think there was no strategy for independence, and people knew that. And therefore, they're going to suffer from a low turnout of many of the pro-independence working class supporters. If I could just come back to reform. The interesting thing about reform is, back in April, before Nigel Farage became leader, the top 20 seats where Reform was performing best are all in areas of high levels of poverty, former mining, steel and shipbuilding constituencies with low migrant populations, so mainly white. These are former either existing Labour seats or Labour seats that they lost to the Tories in 2019. So I think it's going to be interesting in the course of this evening. It's another of these sub-stories, but seeing that Reform, to repeat myself, are doing well, potentially, at the expense of Labour, not just the Conservatives. And that is going to be something I think we're going to have to worry about going down the road.
I think this sub-story as well, though, is it not? It's the idea of the fear of the other. That really is what the Reform Party has been trying to push, that they have tried to put forward. But I also think, with the SNP especially, in terms of how they reached a pinnacle in 2015 where you had that particular vote. So I think that the SNP have actually been falling since Alex Salmond, because it was a generational point. The referendum was a generational point, and we needed to necessarily get past another generation to necessarily bring that particular issue back up again.
Just to lighten the mood, the Secretary of State for Wales, David T.C. Davis, has said he has lost his seat in Monmouthshire.
Okay. Well, there's going to be a lot of that coming up in the course of the evening. But for the moment, I'm delighted to be joined by Samaya Ahmed from the Muslim Vote Lead Volunteer for Wales. She's a community organiser and mobiliser and has been involved in political activism for 2 decades. Samaya, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Give us your first reaction to the exit poll.
Well, I'm very happy to hear the news about David Davis. We had problems with him in Wales, and he was generally very dismissive of the Muslim community. Not just the Muslim community, but the community in general in Wales, because the population in Wales is a peaceful population, is one that wants justice and peace for everybody. They're a population who have experienced colonialism, whether that's accepted by the English or not, but it is something, a sentiment that is present in Wales, and it's a sensitive topic for them. So I'm very happy that that news transpired. The exit polls, it was expected that there's going to be this big win for Labour. We're also happy that the numbers are up for the Lib Dems, even though we would have liked even more of a win. But very interestingly, there are 25 other, and I'd be very welcoming to hear how these other 25 break down.
Yeah, those figures may include the Northern Irish results, so not necessarily others in England. In England. What do you make of the prediction that Reform are going to get 13 seats? I mean, that's double what anybody said they were liable to get in the pre-election polls. It's
very worrying. At the same time, it works very well with the rest of Europe. The far right are on the rise. It looks like Europe as a whole has become more of a hostile, maybe continent for others, very anti-immigration, but very happy to subjugate others across the globe. And it is very worrying. It's worrying for us here in the UK because this anti-immigrant sentiment and this very far-right European sentiment only arrived much later than it did in the rest of the European continent.
We're getting predictions now that Nigel Farage is 99% likely to win the Clacton seat. I don't know whether it's possible for Nigel Farage to get more TV exposure than he already gets, but no doubt the broadcasters in the mainstream will find a way of doing that. What do you feel is likely to be the outcome for Labour vis-a-vis Plaid Cymru in Wales?
I do believe that Plaid is making gains, even though their gains are very slow. Maybe they'll win another seat or two on top of the 3 that they already have in Parliament. But in terms of the popular support of Plaid, I have seen an increase in support in Wales for Plaid. There is also
Plaid very instrumental in getting support for Palestine.
They were, and passing the motion for ceasefire in the Senate, and they played a very, very vital role in supporting activists in Wales as well for Palestine. So we're very happy that their support is growing, and we're looking forward to making sure that we invest in that support and that we make as many gains from that support as we can and work together for the betterment of the society at large. So
we're getting the result now from Hoyton and Sunderland South, where Labour have won their first seat of the night, but I guess the equally important news from is that Reform have come second in that constituency.
Wow!
So that's on the screen now. That's quite a vote. 11,000 votes for reform to Labour's winning on 18,000.
Well, this is confirmation of what I'm trying to say. Is that the polls are already, the opinion polls before the election were indicating that in those northern seats, reform was doing well. These were the top 20 seats, and Sunderland wasn't part of that. Wasn't in the top 20, but other seats in the northeast were. So I think whether Starmer will pay any attention to this, given his landslide victory, but this is not good news for Labour. And I think you've got to say something here that, Starmer is seen. I was talking about how Sinnock is perceived by some of his supporters, but I think Starmer is perceived in the north. It's very strange. They went on about Corbyn was from Islington, and he looks like a London insider. And this doesn't play well in the northeast. And I think what's going to be interesting, I don't know if you've got it, is the percentage of vote in Sunderland. It was low in the last election. It was around 40%. I suspect it will be lower even this time round. And again, that's something that Labour has to look at. So again, the devil's in the detail here. How much Labour is winning by in terms of votes, the percentage turnout, is very important going down the future. I agree, given this result, they'll probably win the next election. But long term, the Labour vote is going down.
I think it's also a case of one footstep behind Europe itself, because what we're finding is that when we are seeing these kinds of results, the parties that were always affected and were fighting each other, for example, the Conservatives and Reform, is whether or not there can be some sort of coalition that's formed between them at some point to challenge in the future. And that is more of a concern as well for a lot of people. But what are your thoughts as well?
Samara, is there going to be a reform challenge in Wales? Because there are plenty of areas that look just like Sunderland in the industrial belts of Wales.
Well, the Conservatives, when they're losing, they're either losing to Reform or to Lib Dems or to Plaid. And so it's very interesting. It would be very relevant to look at the percentages and to look at the voting swings in those seats, and if Reform does get a foothold in Wales. Wales is very much a Labour stronghold because of its coal mining history and the fact that Labour is historically or let's say Wales is historically the Labour kind of basin, but things change. We've seen Reform come out of having no seats to 13 seats. That's
prediction, yeah.
Can I just come in? In Houghton and Sunderland South, Reform have polled 29% of the election results. Now, for a new party, which I know UKIP was existing before, but to come from nowhere to win a third of the vote in Sunderland and Houghton, that is an achievement.
Yeah.
And if this is going to be repeated, and I say this wasn't even in their top 20 seats, this is going to indicate that the idea that they were going to win seats from Labour in places like the two Barnsley seats and elsewhere looks like it could be on course.
So, it looks as if Labour are losing votes to Reform and to the Greens, actually, in some areas. So,
Bristol.
Yeah, it's a peculiar kind of landslide, because when it comes down to the proportion of the vote, it's there, but it looks thin, doesn't it?
It's a peculiar election altogether, to be honest, where at the end of a term where Tories have failed miserably for the past, I don't know how many years it's been, it's just very predictable that Labour is going to win, but also very predictable that it will also not be able to hold that win for very long. Reform is on the rise. It's going to be the new home for the angry Conservative voter who's fed up from the old ways of the Tory party and will look for a new home. And it looks like that's the new home, and it's very worrying given the manifesto and the way Reform presents itself.
So the leader of the Green Party is saying that the tectonic plates are shifting in British politics. There, it's up on the screen now. I think it's a little early to say whether they're shifting very decisively in the Greens' direction. She's wishing the Labour government well, wants it to succeed. Again, I'm not sure that's speaking to her constituency, but or at least all of it. But anyway, we've got a whole evening to see exactly how well the Greens are going to be doing. Samaya, before you go, do you think this kind of result will drive the support for Plaid Cymru in Wales?
If Plaid Cymru plays this well, does what it needs in the 5 years to come before the next election, I think it could play very well. The important thing is that for Plaid to remain true to some of the amazing policies that they do have, and to refrain from attracting, the very far right, very unwelcoming, unwanted.
I mean, if I could just come in, I mean, what's interesting, I think, in Wales is the rise in support both for devolution, the Welsh Parliament. If you recall, it's 50-50 back in 1998, and the support for independence, which is the same as it was in Scotland in 2014. I mean, this is a profound change in Wales.
Yeah, but I think it will be probably a lot more difficult than it is in Scotland to achieve independence, but it's going there. It's slowly, but probably surely getting there.
Samaya Ahmed, thanks very much for joining us for that comment.
Thank you.
So we've had the first result, and it is a surprising one, not because Labour held it, but because the challenger to them was the Reform UK
And
party.
the exit polls are now saying Reform are going to win the 2 seats from Labour in Barnsley, and they're going to win in Hartlepool.
Which will be an amazing turnaround. Wasif, do you think that Labour is equipped to deal with the kind of challenge that Reform looks as if it's going to be posing?
No, because it's a completely different shift in relation to what they are thinking about. You're trying to deal with issues on the ground that are solid, that this is the economy, this is where you actually stand, this is solid grounding. Reform is looking at issues that are effectively non-issues for a lot of people, but it's the fear of those issues. And so it's actually trying to get a handle of what actual points they are actually trying to put forward. Right now, they're just playing to fairs. And I think it's because there is such an apathy with everything else, with the normalised standard that we have. I think that Labour are going to find it difficult to deal with something that you can't necessarily tangibly touch. And that's the issue.
Here's Private Eye with President Joe Biden's reaction to Sir Keir Starmer's victory. On the phone, congratulations, Mr. Churchill.
Let's just talk a little bit about what all this is going to depend on in the next 5 years, or going to have a significant impact on it, is the state of the economy. Labour have made it absolutely clear that there isn't going to be any increase in spending unless the economy can afford it. The economists are predicting a growth rate over the next 5 years of 1.2%, which is barely growth at all. If you were Nigel Farage looking at that coincidence, you'd be rubbing your hands with glee, wouldn't you?
Oh, I'd be looking across the English Channel at the Rassemblement National and looking at Marine Pen and seeing where they're picking up votes. And the Rassemblement National, former Front National, has picked up support in small rural France, working class and middle class people, areas like the Pas de Calais, former mining area. So the picture, when I was going back, the picture in Europe isn't that different from that in Britain. Farage looks, as I say, predicted to win the 2 seats in Barnsley and Hartlepool. These are exactly similar seats to where Rassemblement National are doing well in France, with a low migrant population, overwhelmingly white, which is the case in France as well. So the picture is very interesting. And with Rassemblement National looking set to win the elections in France, hopefully not, but it's a worrying trend here.
Well, we've got another guest joining us now, Riaz Hassan. Riaz has been working with the electoral data to identify target constituencies. He has a background in data analytics and economics, and is part of the Thinking Muslim podcast. Riaz, welcome to the program. What do you make of the projections so far? Obviously, they're likely to be pretty accurate where the main parties are concerned. Do you think they're going to be as accurate when it comes down to projections for the SNP or for Reform UK?
Yeah, so thank you for having me on, firstly. I think the exit poll is kind of roundabout what people were expecting about a week or so ago, with perhaps a tad more seats for the Conservatives. It's not the worst case scenario for the Conservatives that people were expecting. However, one take of caution that I would say with the exit poll is that the exit poll is based upon a sample of about 20,000 people. Now, 20,000 people is distributed across the country in various zones. But the target zones, for example, where the Muslim vote is looking at in terms of standing independence, so forth, how far or how accurate that is for that is perhaps another case in point, because that is uncharted territory for a lot of these polls. So we need to have an understanding of that game will kind of play out as the night goes along, I think, more than anything.
How much faith did you put in those polls that projected the kind of national poll into specific constituencies? I mean, there were two types of polls going on before the election. The ones that were actually conducted in a particular constituency, and then there were the ones which weren't, but which made projections about them. That second type, were they ever? Should we rely on them?
Well, I think in traditional constituencies, you can perhaps rely on some of those, because where there's a straight fight, let's say, between Labour and the Tories or the Lib Dems, or even some sort of, near recent entrants entering into the picture like Reform, you can kind of build in some sort of confidence into there. But where there's a independent standing, for example, Ilford North, Liane Mohammed, where something has just come from a standing start and just kind of almost upsetting the balance almost, that is very, very hard for any kind of polls to predict moving forward. And that, relies on sample size and attitudes of people. And the measure for that is, at the moment, it's unknown, but as the night progresses, it'll be a lot more stable and a lot more accurate.
What do you make of the projection for Reform UK? It's 13 seats. Yeah. That's double what I think any poll predicted before the election. That's quite a significant error to make, isn't it?
Yeah, so when I was driving to the counting station here and hearing the exit poll at 10 o'clock, that's the first thing that struck out to me, was the 13 seats for Reform. That's something I wasn't actually expecting at all. Now, John Curtis has mentioned that there's a margin of error in there in terms of if the exit poll is slightly off, that number of seats may dwindle by quite a bit, or it may actually increase to even something like 20. So that margin of error is really important, and it's really difficult for any kind of pollster to predict. So as the night moves along, we'll understand the accuracy of that. But 13 seats, certainly, if we were to take that as read, is very, very high compared to what most people were expecting Reform to behave in this manner. So, yeah, that is very, very surprising.
And can we draw any conclusion about the accuracy of that projection for Reform from the one constituency which has actually declared, the Houghton and Sunderland South constituency, where they emerged as the runner-up? I think something like 18,000 votes to Labour's 29,000. I mean, that's a, that does that make you think that maybe that poll is accurate?
Well, actually, just that result, if you were to take just that result as a sample, it kind of makes me think that Reform would perhaps exceed 13 seats, because the margin, I don't know what the previous margin was in that constituency, but from Bridget Phillipson's 18,000 to Reform's 11,000 seems quite a leap for Reform in that constituency. So that actually shows that the actual prediction of the number of seats may have been even a tad conservative on the Reform side. So it may even actually increase as the night goes along, which is actually really worrying for the majority of the population here, I think.
I just interject. I mean, Houghton and Sunderland South saw the turnout 6% down. So that's not great for Labour, actually.
Yeah. Is that what you're expecting, Riaz, across the I mean, lots of people have been saying there's going to be an emerging problem here, which is that Labour has this whacking great big majority in the Commons, but on a vote, a share of the vote, which may turn out to be smaller than Jeremy Corbyn's share of the vote in 2017.
Yeah, so certainly the apathy has kind of built on the Labour side of things as well, because over the past few weeks, when the pollsters have been predicting a heavy Labour majority, I think the apathy within Labour voters has actually increased because they've almost taken it as read. And then this figure, the first figure, which is again a very small sample, so we have to be careful about understanding or reading too much into the Sunderland result, but actually 6% down in turnout is within a degree of accuracy there. But again, it's a very, very small sample. So we have to wait for at least 5 or 10 results to come in to understand if there is a national trend towards a lower turnout for the Labour vote. But again, you know, from a totally selfish perspective, that actually means that actually is beneficial to the Muslim vote, for example, where independent candidates are standing up. So a lower Labour turnout would mean a higher chance of an independent success as well.
What do you think would look like a good vote for those independents? Because it's hard to see very many of them as outright winners, but they will be looking at what to say, okay, that was worth doing again.
Yeah, so I think the whole exercise is built around developing a level of confidence within that Muslim vote base, really, to understand that, you know, you can actually succeed or actually make an imprint on with an independent voice. So that's really the measure of success. So where it stands numerically is, I think, different for different seats. But I would just say that I slightly disagree with your presumption that we may not have any victories in there, because I think, again, because it's so hard for that exit poll to predict on those independent seats, we may see a few victories there. And, you know, I'm looking at about 3 or 4 or maybe 5 seats that I think we should certainly keep an eye out for. In terms of that independent victory, you know, one is Dewsbury, Birmingham, Perry Barr, in addition to Ilford North, Leicester South, Luton South. So these kind of seats are very much ripe for the taking. And on the doorstep during the campaigning, we have seen a high propensity of support for the independent candidature in these seats. So let's see how the night develops. Let's see, you know, what results come in and how they, you know, stack up against other things, because there's a number of factors at play here. It's not just building that support for the independent base, but it's also understanding how far there is Tory apathy and the Tory propensity to change to Labour as well, because that also comes into the mix into determining whether an independent succeeds in some of these seats as well.
Okay. Riaz Hassan, thanks very much for joining us and giving us the insights into the data crunching that's been going on about the election.
John, I'd like to come in very quickly as well. There has been a very interesting story that's come in from The Guardian, actually. In Barnsley North, the exit poll predicts that Labour's Dan Jarvis is likely to lose his seat to a former Reform candidate who was dropped by the party list over alleged racist comments. So these particular independents are not necessarily just independents that are from the left, but this particular independent is now Robert Lomas, and I couldn't even bring myself to say what he's actually said and for why he's been dropped by the Reform Party, and it's likely that he will win in Barnsley North. It's quite disgusting, actually, what he actually said, but it looks like that he will win that.
I mean, that's quite a place to be, isn't it? That somebody who's too racist for the Reform Party gets dropped and wins anyway.
I mean, that's frightening. And it has to be said that while we're looking at Labour overall nationally taking 36% of the vote, if you add the Conservative and Reform vote together, that comes to 43%. So we shouldn't just think because the Tories are in disastrous results tonight that the right are out of this game. Labour have held Blyth and Ashington. We haven't got the details. The turnout is down. We don't know who came second, so let's find out.
Okay. Well, we're going to move back to our senior political correspondent, Maz Patel. He's out in Walthamstow now. Maz, can you hear us okay?
I can certainly hear you, John. I'm in a very, very windy and cold. I can't believe the temperature's like 14 degrees outside when it was a beautiful sunny day, perfect for an election, certainly in London. I don't know what the rest of the country was like. And we are here in Waltham Forest where, again, there are a number of elections taking place in various constituencies. None more so, obviously, it's been in the national headlines, where Faiza Shaheen is challenging the Labour candidate and Ian Duncan Smith, the Tory, the incumbent Tory. Interesting to see what happens there. But also, there's been another very, very interesting election taking place in the seat right next door to it. And I've got the challenger, or one of the challengers with me, none other than Councillor for Redbridge, Chanel Johnson. Chanel, thank you for joining us. It's always good to speak to a candidate to find out what's been going on. How was election?
It's been fantastic. There's been so much love in the room, especially people that have come through for the independent movement. As an independent candidate, we've only run a very, very short campaign. It's been, 34 days for us. Yeah. And we've been able to galvanise lots of people, and they've given us so much support.
It must be difficult for an independent because every day the big... Whereas your voice, you've got to have people on the doorstep knowing who you are, and a lot of people are apprehensive and what's an independent going to do because of the offer. Did you find that to be the case in your election?
It was a bit of a mixed bag because we came with something completely different, which is grassroots politics. We were bringing back what I call the assembly model, and that means that people get to decide for themselves. And just that hope that was giving the people at the doorstep, people at the train stations, just that hope alone is what got us through it.
So tell me, how do you think you performed? You said it's a very short period of time. We know the Prime Minister called an election where not many predicted that to happen.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's been such a short campaign. There's not enough people that... Excuse me. Bless you. There's not enough people that actually will have had the chance to actually engage with us. So what we did was we set up Zoom calls. We've actually done public assemblies, and we've made ourselves as available as we possibly could be in the time that we had.
Pollsters are predicting a huge from the Tories to Labour, predicted to win over 400 seats. However, I've just been looking, the share of the vote for Labour compared to 2019 has actually gone down by 1%. That's the prediction, which means in terms of Labour's performance, cumulatively, it's probably there, well, as it was in 2019, if not a little bit lower than that. What's your view on that?
Well, it's to be expected, I believe, because we've seen so much voter apathy. People are actually genuinely worried about much of the same. Yeah. And you've seen the apathy towards Keir Starmer and the leadership and the model that is. And people are genuinely saying, well, if we're going to get much of the same, why should we even bother to vote? And that's why being an independent candidate has brought some of that hope back to the people. I mean, I received an email today that even said, I don't know very much about you, but I saw what you've been doing on socials and I think that you're great. And I was so humbled by that because I said, it's not about me, it's about what we can do. And an independent candidate has the opportunity to do that because we're not backed by a party machine. Mm-hmm. So it is.
Tell us about how the other independent who's in the neighbouring constituency has had national headlines, which is Faiza Shaheen, because of the way she was deselected by Labour right at the last minute. I mean, you're obviously in the same sort of area. What's the feeling like about her challenge?
I think it's been received really positively because she is local and a fantastic campaign. But for her, it's been a lot longer than the few days that we've had because she's actually got name recognition from when she ran 4 years ago. Yeah. So,
and in terms of the issues, let's talk about the issues. A lot of people who would be supporting independence were very, very upset about the government's policy, the Labour Party policy on Gaza, Palestine, and what's been unfolding there. Has that been translated? Have you seen much of that in evidence?
It's come up a lot. And again, you first met me when I became an independent councillor, and you was the first exclusive to have the exclusive on why I left Labour. And why I left Labour was because what I'd seen, I wasn't comfortable with, and nobody should be. Yeah. And it goes deeper than that, because also you've seen it, the level of anti-black racism that is very much present, what they did to Diane Abbott, what they've done to Faiza Shaheen. You're actually seeing it, and I don't think we should be in a divisive community. We're better than that, and we should be coming at it from a place of humanitarian needs and support. And that's why it upsets me on a visceral level, and that's why I stood, because I said I've got to stand for something that's a bit different, and that means peace, it means hope, it means justice, it means freedom, it means all of the good values that we should be standing for as a country that's looking for a better way forward.
And in terms of, we've just had 2 election results that have been announced. Reform UK have actually come second in both those results, and they're actually predicted to defeat Dan Jarvis of the Labour Party, was in the shadow cabinet. A name you must have heard, was touted as leader at one point. He's predicted to lose his seat to the Reform candidate who actually made racist comments and was disowned by Reform as well. What do you make of that? Where do you think this factor about Reform is something that we really need to keep an eye on?
We've got to keep an eye on it, because people feel so disconnected to what good could look like that they're actually looking at the other and scapegoating really their issues on what shouldn't be scapegoated on, and bringing race into the equation. Like Great Britain, if we just look at that in its entirety, and the fact that we've had such a long connection with the Commonwealth countries, which is probably what's brought you and I to these shores.
Absolutely.
So our connection to this country is forever long and will be forever long. So wider communities have got to see that we're a part of this community and not other us. And that's what we're seeing with some of the rhetoric that came through, like the comment that was made about the Bangladeshis. That hurt me on a visceral level, because I'm from the West Indies, and it wasn't so long ago that we're just now seeing people being served justice after what happened in the Windrush episode. That I don't want to see any other communities have to go through that. And having had experienced that, the last thing I want to do is have that torture faced onto somebody else. You've lived here for 60, 70 years of your life, and then suddenly you're getting asked to return to where? A country that you have no connection to?
Can I say, I mean, obviously that's something which resonates a lot with minority ethnic communities. But can I ask you, in terms of its response, is it to stay within the major political parties? For example, Labour or the Conservatives, we know they have people of colour who look just like you and I, but speak the same language as those who we would say are beyond the pale, so to speak. You know, Suella Braverman with her comments, even Rishi Sunak, you know, with some of the statements that he's been making. And we know, obviously, perhaps it's predictable that there will be politicians making comments such as those made by Starmer on Bangladesh, but not those who are from those communities. Ben Habib, none other than a Pakistani ex-national, or was a Pakistani, was born in Pakistan, is deputy leader of Reform. We also had, and I'll finish on this, a huge donation made by a young Sri Lankan Muslim entrepreneur to Reform UK. He gave £1 million to Nigel Farage.
Well, why are they doing that? It's the connection that they feel that they're going to make with those communities. But it is disengaging, and it is disingenuous, and it is actually quite hurtful that we can't come in on a platform of peace. And there's more that unites us than what divides us, and that must be the message that we're sending out there. There's got to be some hope.
Okay, Chanel, back to tonight. What's your prediction? How many votes do you think you'll score? What will be classed as a really good job, and what do you think is the next iteration for you?
That's a really good one, and I have no idea what today's going to look like, but it's already been a win for me, and it's been a win for us, because what we've seen is we've had 3 major assemblies, and they were fantastic. And considering we only started this 34 days ago, so to have the 3 assemblies that we've had, and to have reached, I think it's nearly 500,000 on the socials, I didn't think we were going to do that.
2026 is the next local elections. You're a councillor. Is there scope for independence moving forward, certainly in the London locals?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. We're here, and we're here to stay.
Well, John, there you have it. Chanel Johnson, Councillor Chanel Johnson from Redbridge, who is a candidate, shall I say, saying we are here to stay. I think she speaks really well, and is somebody who I've always been very impressed with.
Maz Patel out there in Waltham Forest, thanks very much. We'll be returning to you in the course of the evening as you tour the London constituencies, picking up the story on the ground there. But back to discussion in the studio. I want to take a look now at the change in the vote percentage, because we've had the headline projection for the seats. But this is a really interesting story and may turn out in the long run to be the most interesting story. Obviously, the big story is reform, a 15% jump for reform. The Liberal Democrats are saying they've had an historic evening, but actually their vote has gone down by 2.4%, and that's a vote that's gone down on a very, very low vote in the previous election. The Greens have gone up by 3.3%, and that's more than Labour's gone up. The Labour vote has only risen by 3.2% on what everybody regards as an absolutely disastrous election result in 2019. So that means they're only 3.2% higher than the vote that Jeremy Corbyn got and was castigated for getting in 2019, and is much lower actually than Jeremy Corbyn's vote in 2017.
It's lower than what Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017. Now, Sir Keir Starmer blames Jeremy Corbyn for losing the Labour election. Starmer is going to win an overwhelming majority with less votes than Jeremy Corbyn got Labour in 2017. Now, he's not got the ability to recognise that fact. But I mean, the shock is that in Blyth and Ashington, Reform comes second. Now, this is a solid working class seat in the northeast of England. I mean, this goes back to Labour's origins in terms of as a working class party in the mining areas. A Labour left winger, Ian Lavery, who voted for a ceasefire in Gaza, has been returned with 20,000 votes. Reform comes second with 10,800, ahead of the Conservatives in 6,000. Now, if this is repeating itself, Reform are going to be coming into safe Labour seats like this, and from nowhere coming second. Now, some people are already saying, well, they're getting votes off Tories. There aren't enough Tories in Blyth and Ashington to get 10,000 votes when the Conservatives are still getting 6,000. They're clearly getting votes from people, probably not from Labour direct, but people who voted for Brexit and who felt let down by Starmer Labour in the last election because of this second referendum problem. This is a problem. And I think you're again seeing, I'm seeing Gideon Rachman from the Financial Times saying we're potentially 2 elections away from the situation in France. That could be alarmist, but I mean, I think there's a point to it.
I do think that one thing that we have to take into consideration is the cult of personality. The cult of personality, remember, when this election was announced, Nigel Farage wasn't even standing. He wasn't even going to stand. And now he's more than 99% likely to win Clacton. On top of that, you've also got Jacob Rees-Mogg that's just come out to say that if they'd kept Boris Johnson as leader, they wouldn't have suffered as badly. So again, because there's no substance to what is differentiating some of these parties, the cult of personality, I think, has been quite important, not only to show the rise in one party, but also the fall in another.
Okay. Well, we've got another guest on the line now. I'm very pleased to be joined by political columnist Abu Bakr Nana Bawa. Thanks very much for joining us, Abu Bakr. Let's just have a look at those vote shares. Labour's going to be winning a landslide on only a 3.2% increase on what was widely regarded as the disastrous election share in 2019. Reform is going to be on some 15% rise in their vote. Liberal Democrats down by 2.4%, even though their seats are massively increased. The election system looks a bit like a lottery on those figures, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. What we've seen tonight is Labour achieve a massive majority, but a very shallow one where where people across the country are not excited for a Labour Party, haven't really given Labour the size of the mandate that the seats would suggest. And really importantly, we've seen a huge increase in the votes for Reform and an increase in vote for the Green parties, which shows people are really seeking alternatives out there. And if Labour do not have answers to the real serious problems that these countries facing in the next 5 years, then we will see the rise of the far right, and we will see the rise of alternative parties. So it's really imperative that we hold the Labour government to account the next 5 years and make sure that they deliver for all people in the UK.
And presumably, I mean, something is going to have to be done to address the concerns of those people in constituencies like Houghton and Sunderland, that have gone for reform in such big numbers. They're not, the classic kind of far-right audience.
Yeah, absolutely. What we are seeing is nothing to do with the popularity, I believe, of the Reform Party's policies or their or the quality of their manifesto. What we are seeing is much like Brexit. It's a retaliation, an anger at the failure of the Conservative Party, the failure of the British establishment to actually address any of the concerns people are facing. Unfortunately, this gives rise to people who give rather simple suggestions, such as it is a fault of immigration, to rise, to rise and give them prominence. But these people can be won back over if we simply address the challenges they're facing, improve the state of our NHS, invest in our education, improve the infrastructure of this country, and by doing so, we can create a hopeful country again that wouldn't need the likes of figures like Nigel Farage to answer these really difficult questions.
Do you think that there's a lot of work now needs to be done in order to get the kind of challenge that came from the independents and the left into a more coherent shape? Because, at the end of the evening, if a couple of the independents do well, if the Greens increase their representation, it might be that they have a bunch of MPs not that far short of the number that Reform have got. But it won't look like that because they will be dispersed across a number of formations, whereas Reform has got a single, very clear profile.
Yeah, work is needed to be done. This is a movement that has really sparked since October the 7th, well, the events of October 7th and the subsequent events that took place, including the refusal of the Labour Party to vote for the ceasefire. It's a movement that's 6 months old. Green Party have been around for a number of years. But really, as we've seen in the council elections, and we've seen a number of council elections for a number of years, the Green Party really do have local clout and a local ability to garner support. Work needs to be done to scale that with the Green Party, with other national parties to take that to a national level. And really interestingly, it will be interesting to see what Jeremy Corbyn's next steps are if he does in fact win Islington North, as is predicted by many commentators tonight.
Yeah, obviously we'll have to wait to see that. The official call is that it's too close in Islington North, but the balance of that, there have been some very good reports on the ground, very queues outside the polling stations in Islington North, and there can't be many parts of the country where the turnout has been as strong as that. In terms of the reconfiguration of the political right, it's going to be very difficult, even if they wanted to resist the pressure of Reform UK on the Tory party, if it's the case, not only that Reform do well, but that they do well when they're runners-up, as well as when they take some seats.
We saw this in a less extreme fashion or less splashy fashion in 2015, where UKIP managed to come second in many seats and force a Brexit referendum. So it'll be very interesting to see how the Conservative Party respond. But more importantly, as a party of government, it's very important to see how Labour Party respond, because Reform will come in second places behind many of these Labour Party candidates. And it's very important that the Labour Party do not cower the pressure from the right, but provide real hope and substance to the people of the UK. And this is the only way to dispel, the threat of the far right, as seen in France, where Macron provided a very centrist platform for a number of years, and now we're here with a very strong likelihood that Le Pen's party are going to win. So if they do not provide an ambitious program, if they do not really provide solutions to the challenges people are facing, then the threat of the far right will only carry on increasing. So this is the challenge that they have to take, because the voters for Reform are not those of the far right. They're ordinary British people who want to see their country do better, and it is time that the Labour Party deliver for them.
What do you think will be Keir Starmer's reaction to this? Because this is something he didn't see coming, didn't address the question of reform hardly at all in the course of the election campaign. That silence won't be acceptable going forward, will it?
Well, Keir Starmer is in for a very rude awakening if he thinks this 400 plus seats he looks set to win provides him an extremely strong mandate, because frankly it doesn't. People are not looking forward to this Labour government. They're only voting for them in retaliation to the failure of the Conservative Party. So it really, really does mean that they have a very short amount of time to start getting things right, because on the campaign trail, not only did they fail to address the concerns of reform voters, they failed to address the concern of Muslim voters, working class voters, the concerns of voters from the black community, voters from across the country, which is why you've only seen a tiny percentage increase in votes. And really, their electoral victory can be put down to the collapse in the Conservative Party vote, which has not in fact gone to the Labour Party, but has gone to Reform.
Okay, Abubakar Nanababwa, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on the first few hours of the election results. Looks like, according to some projections, that Galloway might lose his seat. What do you make of that?
As I said earlier, I think there's a big difference in a by-election in which the focus was very much on Gaza, and I think you could do that in a by-election. I think in a general election it's much more difficult when other issues are in play. The economy, mortgages, job, the whole cost of living crisis. I think it was always going to be difficult for George Galloway to hold that seat, given it. So I think that wouldn't be something unexpected. Can I just say that this is an interesting comparison. In 2017, in Sunderland, South and Houghton, Labour won 24,665 votes. This election, they won 18,837. So, it's reinforcing that, under Jeremy Corbyn, actually Labour was polling more votes in a seat like this, Sunderland and South and Houghton, than under Keir Starmer. Labour still win, but it's because of the first-to-passport system. And, of course, as we said, Reform have come second in that seat, which is not even in the top 20 best seats in Britain.
I think you also have to take into consideration there's been a massive chunk of the party that has effectively been taken away from Labour. So the momentum chunk, that particular area, that particular number. Remember, there was £3 and you can join Labour, and there was this kind of surge in the membership. What we're finding now is that there is now not that bottom-up approach that Jeremy Corbyn had, but effectively now you've got the top-down approach with, in the last month or so, large-scale donors, a number of different donors that have given a large amount of money to him. We've noticed that the markets have been a little bit more stable. There's been no real effect on the pound. These are all issues that I think has been a compacted transition, knowing that this is how it's going to work.
Do you think it is now the case that it's obviously something that Starmer's driving at, attempting to present Labour as a business-friendly party, and he's not the first Labour leader to do that by any means. But do you think he's been almost more successful than he might want to be, in the sense that very large chunks of working class Britain now look on the Labour Party as essentially a middle class party which has no sense or feel about what their lives are like?
It's interesting because look at Keir Starmer, look at the name Keir Starmer. His dad gave him that name because he named him after who?
Keir Hardie.
Keir Hardie. And who is Keir Hardie? The founder of the Labour Party. There is a distinction with regards to what we see in terms of what the Labour Party was to what it is. And yes, there is a globalised economy. Yes, there is change in so many different things. But the haves and the have-nots have always been there. And there are many more have-nots today than there were yesterday. And this is an important factor, I think, because we're not tapping into that. We're just taking what's at the very top.
What worries me is that I suspect at this very moment, Labour's number crunchers, the pollsters, will be looking at this Reform vote. Okay, admittedly it's only in 2 seats, but looking at this and saying, look, in the general election, this general election campaign, Sir Keir, you competed to show you were just as tough on migration as Rishi Sunak. You made those statements at the Bengalis. You need to keep doing this. And it will continue in the demonisation, particularly of migrants, people fleeing war, fleeing dictatorship, trying to come to this country. And the lesson we must take from across Europe is every time centrist politicians do this, it benefits the far right. It benefits the far right. That's what we've seen in France. And yet, that's the mindset. And that's why I think when Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times says we might only be 2 elections off what's happening in France, he may not be that far out, because if a Labour government cannot sort the economy out, is attacking migrants, we've seen that the far right in Britain have grown, not on the same scale as in France in the past, but looking at France, you can see the conditions in which those people who've voted for reform can gather even greater support in areas of the country which have been devastated by deindustrialisation, by poverty and the rest of it.
What do you think the impact of this is going to be when we have a situation, in some constituencies at any rate, where reform are emerging as the challenges to Labour? You know, Keir Starmer can have that attitude, the attitude that you describe at the top. But if you're Ian Lavery and your challenger is a reform candidate, you are very motivated to participate in movements that are opposing the far right. Not from whatever, and I'm sure Ian Lavery does actually hold this as a point of principle, but even if he didn't, there's a raw electoral calculation, a realpolitik electoral calculation to get stuck into getting some kind of movement against these people. That won't be shared at the top, but for lots of Labour MPs, that will be a thing.
For a number of Labour MPs, but I think, you know, we're now talking about a much weaker Labour left. I mean, some will slip through the net because of vetting. A result like this will mean not everyone's been vetted completely. So some left Labour MPs might get through, we don't know about. But the Labour left is much weaker, and it's been cowed as well by the intimidation of Sir Keir Starmer. So I suspect the dominant thing will be triangulation, that horrible word. That they will look at the polls and say, what we have to do is we've got our vote on the left. We can guarantee that. We've got these people who vote for us traditionally. We can guarantee that. We have to worry about the vote on the right. And we have to move and accommodate to that. And that has been the way this election campaign has worked. It's been how Starmer has worked, and I think that's going to be the dominant way that Labour MPs will do so. Yes, a minority will take a hard anti-racist position, but hopefully a job has to be done. But I think I am worried about what the effect of this could be 2-3 years down the road. Part of it also depends on reform creating grassroots organisation. I mean, it's a new party. If it can create that grassroots, it can really start to go places, cutting through.
We'll see. I mean, Chris is talking there about maybe the Labour intake will be so great that some people who, you know, weren't vetted properly from Starmer's point of view are going to turn up on the back benches. But let's talk about vetting and Reform UK. I mean, we've got this one example of somebody who was vetted, found to be racist, and then stands anyway and gets elected. Do you think they properly vetted the second half dozen likely to be elected?
But this is the other point, isn't it? Because of the way in which, you know, we've catapulted into this election, July the 4th coming up as a date. This really kind of changes the dynamics in terms of what you can do and how you can do things very quickly. And of course, with the cult of personality coming in, with Nigel Farage coming in at the top, all of a sudden you have more of a galvanised vote. So now you have to deal with, I mean, to some extent, this is going to sound crazy, but I have some sympathy for Reform in the fact that they have needed to galvanise very quickly. But by the same token, you know the type of characters that you're going to be getting when you have a party that sets its stall out so fervently in relation to anti-immigration, in relation to keeping taxes high to a certain extent, and really, you know, taking that vote for granted, really. That
if I can jump in, here's another result from Sunderland Central, where Reform have again come second, with a 7.7 swing from Labour to Reform. Labour got nearly 17,000 votes, Reform got nearly 11,000 votes. There is a bit of a pattern beginning to emerge here, especially in the northeast of England.
Well, we've got Sadiq Khan's response to the election here, saying that the nation's voted for hope and for change. I mean, given the way that the complexity of these results are coming in, that's a slightly optimistic take on life, isn't it?
Well, I suppose one of the things that, you know, that there's the quote from Wonderful Life, isn't there, where basically it says, every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. The problem is right now, really, it's going to be every time Labour decides to take on a new policy that Reform is now pushing, an angel dies, because it's killing the soul of what that party is about. That really is the challenge for Labour now, is to see how much of its soul it can keep.
I mean, I think this result for Reform, I mean, obviously the big story is Labour's landslide victory, but this result for Reform is come from nowhere. I mean, the polls are suggesting Farage might win in Clacton, and that would be it. They're now talking about 13 seats, but I mean, more importantly, in second place, it looks like Reform are going to be second place in swathes of the country. This is a seismic change. And I can't remember, if someone could correct me, I can't remember a party coming from nowhere and achieving this sort of result thus far. I mean, obviously things might change. It's and to the shock of the polls. So I mean, this in many ways is going to be the story of the evening, I think, of the night, about how well Reform is doing. And I think for Islam Channel viewers, there must be grave concern about this, given its anti-migrant stance and given, I would say, Islamophobia, which is there. Yeah. We've seen it in this election campaign, even in regards to Rishi Sunak, I mean, for goodness sake. So I think for viewers tonight, it should be a cause for concern about Reform as well.
I think it's certainly a wake-up call to suggest that Islamophobia is going to ease in the coming months, or it's going to get better. I don't think that that's going to be the case. I think that there is going to be a need, especially from what's happened with the Muslim vote, for there to be a galvanisation of more civic structures to help in that respect. I don't think it's going to come from the top. That's the concern.
Looks like Professor John Curtis is saying that the SNP and Reform figures are the most unreliable. But they'd have to be very, very unreliable to be good.
I mean, I think what you're talking about is the SNP might get 15 seats. I think the talk of the Tories winning 5 seats from Labour, including the Aberdeen South with Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader, I mean, I do find that hard to grasp. That was certainly not on the script. But it's not going to make a fundamental difference. I mean, if the SNP goes down to 15, that's not some victory. That's still a disaster. And there's going to have to be a debate, and already there is in Scotland on social media. There is a debate. It's already been happening anyway about where this goes. And should I just say, I mean, some of the people, the English coverage is saying, oh, this shows independence is there. Support for independence is still as high as it ever was in Scotland. So there's a disconnect in support for independence and support for the SNP. That's going to harm support for independence, I predict, going down. But I mean, there is still a ground a support for that there. So the issue isn't just going to go away, but it is going to cause a debate in the SNP and the wider independence movement. It's not the sum total about this. Meanwhile, it's been said that Rishi Sunak is going to resign on Friday. So goodness knows who's going to be able to replace him.
Well, let's talk about the Tory party, because I mean, in one sense, it wasn't as disastrous a result, if the polls are true, as we have to keep saying. But in another sense, it's even more disastrous because of the strong Reform showing. So, what is the likely impact of that going to be on what, if these stories are true, is going to be a very, very fast Tory leadership battle indeed? I mean, is it not almost impossible to see any other outcome to that than a Badenoch generic Braverman
I think there
figure?
is going to be a time in the wilderness now, and that's quite obvious that there's going to be a long time in the wilderness. It's how they approach policy, how they approach their core votes that they've previously had, and how they approach Reform, really. It's those particular people because...
Well, I mean, Suella Braverman has said that there ought to be a rapprochement with reform. Some of the Tories are talking about asking Nigel Farage to be leader of the Tory party. So, you know, what do you think the likely... What are the likely combinations of the reform Tory dynamic?
I think it's what we were saying before, that there is potentially this move. We're one step away from what Europe has been doing, and we can see what Europe has done over time. Because they've had proportional representation, they've been able to kind of see, we can see it more easily. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the issues that they're facing on the continent are not what issues we are facing here. And those same issues are coming to the fore in relation to parties that have traditionally stood independently, but actually are the same, essentially, in what they want. It's just they don't say it as loudly. But the motion of the day is that actually the cult of personality is able to take that forward. It's not necessarily the party anymore. It's like in football. So before it used to be the club is the biggest thing. And then all of a sudden you had the Ronaldos and the Messis, and then all of a sudden those people were the ones that pushed everything forward. And it's a similar thing with party politics, whether it's Trump in America, whether it's Nigel Farage over here. That cult of personality is what is pushing some of these parties forward now.
I mean, I think you can get the message coming across inside the Tory party. Angela Edson, who is a former Tory minister, a former contender for the leadership, is saying that reform success is because perhaps we have not been conservative enough. Now, that is saying we need to move to the right. And I think, who is there now? Who's going to survive the night? Kemi Badenoch would appear to be the outstanding candidate. No, she's capable, unlike Liz Truss, but she's going to take us on a right-wing agenda. So she's going to be competing on the same ground as reform, backed up by Suella Braverman and others in terms of this. So if I was Nigel Farage tonight, I'd be thinking, well, actually, the coming agenda, I can set the pace here. I'll have both the Labour and Tories trying to compete to undercut me on the same the ground of my choosing, anti-migration, anti-Islamophobia. I think coming through. I think it's not looking good, and I think Labour are already celebrating in Swindon South, where they seem to have taken the seat of a Conservative member of Robert Buckland. So we will have this huge Labour majority, and the Tories being taken out left, right, and centre. I think if Kemi Badenoch wins in North West Essex, she's must be the front runner to become Conservative.
Or Braverman, maybe generic, but there's no difference in the politics.
No,
politics there. But I mean, just let me put this point to both of you. There is going to be a very big disconnect now, as the evening goes on, and we're still in the early stages, but there is going to be a massive disconnect between the scale of that Labour win and its ability to carry any argument actually in the population as a whole. In other words, it's almost a worst case scenario in some ways of the trappings of authority without the reality of legitimacy.
I think that also comes down to the fact that we never really got a grip of what Labour is about. Keir Starmer was basically on quicksand on a lot of issues throughout this campaign, and what has he put his name to? That becomes a problem because people don't actually know where they stand on certain issues and certain topics. We now know that there is, for every time he wants to appeal to one part of the party in terms of the left, he's still having to appeal to the right as well. So there is this kind of balance with regards to what he has. But because that has not been solidified, the way that reform have solidified some of those points, that's where the problem is.
Because the far right traditionally feed on disappointment. And the relationship between those figures, that is disappointment waiting to happen, isn't it?
And it's worrying in the sense that Keir Starmer is making it clear that he is going to make sure there is that his budget is in order. That's why the markets are completely calm about Keir Starmer's victory. And in fact, they wanted a Keir Starmer victory. The Rupert Murdoch Press did, the Times did, in terms of this. So it doesn't seem like he's going to increase public spending. He's promised things on the NHS, but he's also West Streeting clear privatisation is coming in. The British economy will continue. There's no plan to alter the fundamental fact we are a low-wage, low-skill, low-productivity economy. The majority of people in poverty in this country are in work on low wages. None of that, it seems to me, is looking like it's going to alter. And that is fertile ground for potentially discontent by the right, by reform, etc. It would also seem to me now that we've got to look at what forces, the sorts of forces we've seen mobilised around Gaza, how they respond to this. Not just over Gaza, but over this wider picture now of a resurgent right wing. So that's going to be a fundamental issue starting tomorrow morning for those of us who've marched for Gaza and much else.
Yes, let me give you a bit more news coming in here. Patrick Maguire, who's a Times journalist, is saying that Labour sources in Islington suggest that Jeremy Corbyn could be on course for a narrow victory, likely to be as few as 1,500 votes in it. So that's kind of news that's not news, because with it being that narrow, we won't know till we know. But anyway, if there are good and bad rumours, that's a good one, I guess.
It's seismic, though, isn't it? Because if you think he's almost the father of the house in relation to how long he's been an MP. I mean, since 1983. To see the change in his party, it's absolutely phenomenal. To see where the party was in 1983 when he first came in to where the party is today. The scope of British politics has taken a completely different turn. And I think, again, for the electorate, it's understanding these particular issues. Is it the issue of the day, or is it something that we can really push in relation to social media and how that has also played into it? We've not even talked about how social media has tied into this particular election either.
Just one more stat before you come, Chris. Said that Swindon South victory for Labour achieved on a 6.5% fall in turnout. So, you know, that those poor turnout figures that's what's coming through.
This is the bellwether seat. This was one of the key seats that Labour had to win to get that landslide result. So it would not be a fall in voter turnout in Swindon South would not be because Labour wasn't campaigning there and the Conservatives weren't campaigning to try and hold on desperately there. So it's suggesting that we're going to be in for a night of low turnout and reinforcing the point that this Labour landslide is going to come on the back of its lowest percentage vote since its inception.
Yeah, well, there are people describing this as a sandcastle majority on Twitter. And I mean, I think we were saying earlier, it's broad, but it's shallow. I mean, it's a very, very unstable development, isn't it?
I think this government is unstable. I think there are issues with it. And that is, I think, the point, that we shouldn't give it a honeymoon period. On Gaza, on austerity and all sorts of issues, I think that people have got to be saying the pressure has got to be put on this government as from tomorrow morning.
Well, it certainly isn't going to be able to sit there and rely on and bask in the kind of the glow of a victory, which, you know, it might have been a victory achieved on an increased turnout. They might have enthused people who otherwise had been disappointed for so long with the Tories. Didn't get there.
I think what's going to end up happening as well is it's always going to be the taxes again. Death and taxes with everything else. I think what Labour's policies are going to be in relation to tax is going to be quite important, because that is the thing that is going to push people to say, well, actually, this is why we wanted to vote Conservative, or this is why we wanted to vote Reform, because look at it, Labour's back in and they're putting up those taxes again. I think inheritance tax, already the Telegraph has already said that why Labour's inheritance tax rate would be a disaster for Britain. So those kinds of issues are going to come up.
Well, we're very pleased for the panel to have been joined by Ayman Noor now. He's the marketing coordinator at the Muslim Vote and is a politics, economics and history graduate from UCL. Welcome to the programme, Ayman. So give us your reaction to the results that we've seen so far and to the exit poll.
Well, thank you for having me. My reaction is that the results are, by and large, what we all expected. I think the polls have been clear. And going into this election, we all expected a large Labour majority. And I think for us at the Muslim Vote, victory, especially in this case, was never really an electoral metric. What I mean by that is, if I take you back to before the election was called, and we had our first town hall bringing together stakeholders across the country, we said that our objective in this election was to send a message to get noticed. We didn't even think about winning seats. And I'm here talking from the perspective of the Muslim votes angle, which was to support, you know, pro-democracy, anti-genocide alternatives against the mainstream parties. So when we talk about this alternative push, this alternative movement, on 6 months' notice, which is what we thought we would have, we expected perhaps we wouldn't win a seat, but we would win a lot of close seconds. And now on 6 weeks' notice, what we've seen is a large mobilization of the Muslim community. So I think the results, in one way or another, shouldn't shock us. They shouldn't cause earthquakes, and they shouldn't send us to be too emotional or too reactive. But they should get us to think about what comes next and how we respond together.
I mean, it's true that the core contest between the Labour Party and the Tories is pretty much as predicted, but nobody was predicting that reform vote. Nobody was saying they're going to get 13 seats. Nobody was saying that. They were saying half that or less than half that. So that is a shock, isn't it?
It is. I think it represents and it signifies the sentiment that we're feeling in our community, which is disillusionment with the centrist parties, and with Labour's direction, and with the weakness shown by the Conservative Party over the last 14 years. I think we've also seen a huge upswing, and I'm now talking from my marketing background, in actually young voters turning to reform, because they, in many ways, and this is not a positive statement I'm saying, they're speaking language that people quickly resonate to. They're a populist party. And I think we might not have expected it on this scale, but the sentiment of what we've seen with the reform result is not a surprise. It represents a decay at the core of our politics. And that's a decay that we feel on our side as a Muslim community as well.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yeah.
In relation to social media, because looking at your marketing background, it would be interesting to see how social media has played a part in this particular election. How have you found social media and engagement with social media and the election?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, okay, let's look at Farage, for example. He very quickly became the #1 politician or UK politician on TikTok, and I think that has allowed them to access young voters. When I look at campaigns generally, and I've been fortunate enough to travel across the country to different campaigns that the Muslim vote has been supporting, the ground game always comes first. Canvassers at the door, getting people to come out has always been the priority. However, a lot of the campaigns which expressed that they had a strong ground game felt that they weren't getting young voters, and that was a trend across the region, across the country. So I think social media is an area where the young vote is definitely to be gained, and I think it's an area where major parties have a leg up because they have infrastructure. They can use certain techniques such as paid advertisements, targeted advertisements, very, very efficiently, whereas kind of smaller candidates, newer candidates from smaller parties or without that substantial experience really struggled. And I think we also saw the difference coming from, for example, independent campaigns who had previous experience running with parties. I point attention to Faiza Shaheen's campaign. They ran absolutely excellent social media strategies. And then there's a huge difference between what they were able to do with their party experience and what smaller candidates or newer candidates, perhaps from Workers' Party or even the Green Party and especially independents, were not able to do.
Do you think we need to have, or may need to have, with the growth of reform, an electoral agreement in the way that the French left have now established a popular front where they don't compete against each other in constituencies, where they stand down in order to give the best placed candidate the chance of beating, in this case, Marine Le Pen?
I'm not sure. I think the prospect of allying or making these kind of agreements is always one that should be taken with caution, definitely.
I mean, here's a shock. Labour sources are saying they've lost Sheffield Hallam to the Liberal Democrats.
Oh, isn't that...
the Liberal Democrat is Shafiq Mohammed.
Yeah.
Which is an indication that the Muslim vote could well be in play here.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing for the Muslim vote as well, I mean, there's been a lot that's been said about the lesser of two evils with regards to what you vote for. But with the system, with the voice of Muslims not really having been taken up by Labour at all, are we simply in a situation where we're saying, okay, the lesser of two evils here is I'll take the lethal injection, but I won't take the electric chair? Because what exactly is it that we are going to achieve by being part of this process as well? And because it is a question that's come up within Muslim communities as to whether or not they even engage with this process.
It's definitely a question, it's definitely a concern. I think the absolute first thing that we need to achieve and the first thing we need to shoot for is to have our voice heard. And the reality is that our voter turnout as a community is lower than the national average. However, our proportional voting power as a community is higher than our percentage in the population. And what I mean by that is we're about, as a Muslim community, 7% of the population. But the way we're distributed throughout cities means that our voting power is much more than that. However, we engage less. Before we can talk about what is the big picture, what is the long-term play, how can we achieve what other communities who are of a similar population size have achieved throughout long-term engagement, we need to actually get up and get our systems engaged. We need to be able to go to a community and arrange a hustings like that. Many of the grassroots infrastructure that we need to even begin being heard still need to be developed, but what we have seen in this election is that they have been developed very quickly, and we feel that years of progress have been made in 6 weeks with the fire underneath us.
I think that's a very important point, because we're going to have to look, if the independent candidates get good votes in a number of the seats, like Guildford North, in Holborn and St Pancras, that structure, those structures you're talking about, which have been created, which are still weak, but they need to be consolidated, they need to be built on, and there needs to be campaigning. Not just electoral campaigning, but campaigning in social issues, on Gaza, and much else. We have a chance now, I think. This is a chance for us to build, those independent candidates, to build a presence, a permanent presence in the area. Because coming from nowhere to challenge a machine like Labour is very difficult. Yeah. But these results indicate that the Labour vote is fragile.
Well, here's a bit of a sign of that, and we've been predicting this on the programme already, but Lewis Goodall from LBC is saying that Labour is taking reforms, election wins as a clear message to address immigration. So we all know where that's going to be going. So, Chris, thank to Eamon for coming in today. That's very good to hear from you.
Cool. Thank you very much.
I guess let's put it this way: the fear always is with the growth of the far right that we're going to see a repeat of the kind of politics that we saw in the 1930s, with the kind of outcomes that we saw in the 1930s, and often establishment commentators will say, hang on a minute, I saw this happen on Channel 4 News tonight when Matt Fry interviewed Danielle Obono, who's a radical French MP, just been re-elected, and said, no, these people, they may be far right, but they've left their fascist past behind them. That language isn't really appropriate. It seems to forget that you're watching a process, that not all the characteristics of classical fascism have to be here now. They can accumulate over time.
I mean, I wrote an article about Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National and pre-war fascism, and actually the message is not that different. They're not using. I mean, back then the fascists would talk about we represent the real France, as opposed to the France of these outsiders. Then they would talk about Jews, Freemasons, Bolsheviks. Now they talk about migrants, Muslims, particularly in France. It's not that different. And Marine Le Pen is not stupid. She's a modern fascist. She's going to attack exactly those people who, social neoliberals, who are quite comfortable with women's rights, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth, don't actually feel comfortable with at all, which is migrants and Muslims. We keep repeating it. And Marine Le Pen is focusing on this. And Farage is going to be looking, he knows this already, but he's going to be looking at Marine Le Pen. He's going to be looking at Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who says Europe is being invaded, taken over by Muslims. Just nonsense.
But then I think one of the things you have to always understand as well is that especially for the Islam channel as well, and our viewers, it is a case that Europe itself has always founded itself on what it is not as opposed to what it is. And that was always, we are not Muslim. And that has been a kind of strong tact. I mean, you know, we can talk about fascism and being the kind of other side of the coin of liberal democracy. You needed fascism and that kind of idea of eugenics that was put in place and then turned on its head, and you had democracy and everything else and all the good rights and wells that come from that. So that's it.
I mean, but part of this, Chris, is that characteristics that make up the kind of full pack of sort of fascist organisation can be accumulated over time. I mean, you know, now there must be a very real possibility that some wealthy donors who haven't yet banked on Reform UK will now say, you know, that's a possibility. There's a possibility of them, you know, creating a kind of presence on the streets through a relationship with Tommy Robinson that might have been relatively separate up to this point.
Well, I mean, we've seen how the right, I mean, Suella Braverman literally invited Tommy Robinson to take to the streets on the 11th of November.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to, but then she said, OK, on you go, and he did. And in France, what we've seen, and what worries me about this, Emmanuel Macron in France has prepared the ground for the Rassemblement National with a dreadful neoliberal economic agenda, but also scapegoating. So Keir Starmer, to me, looks like Emmanuel Macron light.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then we've got to worry.
Okay, and we're joined now by another guest, Ibrahim Khan. He's the CEO of a personal finance and investment company, Islamic Finance. So please do tell us what you've been thinking about the election results as you've heard them so far.
Yeah, so I think no one's particularly surprised by the Labour majority. I think for me, what the interesting thing that I was looking for is where the number of votes is panning out for Labour and where the overall majorities for the Labour seats are panning out. And I was seeing some really interesting stats from the BBC on how the number of votes in this election that Labour is projected to get is actually less than the number of votes in the previous election where they lost by a huge landslide. So it seems to me like this is a victory built on sandstone, right, where it's going to crumble if and when the next election comes along and there isn't a Rishi Sunak that everyone wants to vote out. And then I think the other interesting thing, and it's obviously once the data comes through, it's going to be clearer, but in the Muslim areas in particular, from the quick snapshot I got of the map, it looks like the huge majorities that Labour had, it looks like they've winnowed down quite significantly. And I think that is, again, one of those things where right now, because of the, you know, the mood music is, this is a huge Labour win, and rightly so, fair enough. But then underlying that, what's going to happen is these safe seats are going to become very, very critical once it tightens, I think, in the next election. And I think what you know, the gentleman here was saying around how we could see a lurch to the right, and it could go either way. And I suspect the Labour Party, as it's set up right now, is more set up to lurch to the right, unfortunately, because they're seeing second places going to reform in certain areas. So that, you know, is going to incline them in that direction. But I'm hopeful that if they see second places, unexpected second places in, you know, Muslim-heavy areas going, you know, towards some other candidates, that could incline them to lurch, you know, more towards where traditionally Labour used to be. The jury's out, obviously, if they actually listen to that.
I mean, if France is an example, it's probably wrong to think of these processes as either one way or the other, and probably more accurate to think of them as a process of polarisation.
Well, I think in France, what's interesting is we saw the left get its act together and create this new popular front, uniting the left on an anti-racist, anti-fascist ticket, and they came within a whisker of beating an Ensemble national rally. So I think we've got to look at that and think about what that means in Britain, because we should be worrying about reform. And I'll repeat myself, this is Islam Channel. For our viewers, this is worrying. This is very worrying. And it is likely to drive the mainstream British politics to the right as a consequence of this. So we need to be thinking how we respond, and that response cannot just be through Parliament. It's going to have to be continuing the sorts of things we've done around Gaza. So we have to build on our hopeful successes tonight, but we've also got to build on the movements we've created and think about what we're going to do here. So I think there's going to be a lot of discussion tomorrow and over the weekend about how we respond to this, because we cannot trust Starmer to be a shield against the rise of the far right.
I think there is a question to be said about first past the post as well, because it's a circular argument. It comes back down to the type of systems that you have. And so France, you can get away with something else in terms of having that galvanisation. But I think what I'm interested in hearing from you on is how you've been able to galvanise trust and support within a community that has traditionally been, one, either apathetic or otherwise not galvanised enough to kind of understand the power of the vote itself. How has that taken shape over the last 6 weeks?
Yeah, so I think I'm deeply, proud of what our community has done in the very short period of time that it's had, really, over the last, let's say, 6 weeks in particular, but over the last 6 months, post, what we saw in October and November. And, for us as a community, it's unprecedented for us as a community to get together with organizations, that one of IFG, the company that I'm the CEO of, as part of that, where collectively you're talking about, digital, businesses, you're talking about NGOs, you're talking about local community, and you're talking about senior leaders from across, the Muslim spectrum, really representative people coming together and saying, this is the Muslim vote, and this is who we're going to be backing. I mean, that's never been done before. And there's going to be birthing pains to that, of course, right? It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be, clean. There's going to be split votes. It's going to be messy. Our community, this is the first time you do something. It's not going to be, the perfect execution. But I think what we've learned here and what we've gained here in terms of skill sets. I mean, I was canvassing for the first time, a few weeks ago, and that skill set is not just me. It's hundreds and thousands of people.
Can I just say something? I mean, I think it's interesting because this is challenging lazy stereotypes of Islam. You look at someone like Leanne Mohammed. I mean, what a brilliant candidate. And she's absolutely challenging those lazy stereotypes of about women, Islamic women. Absolutely.
So I'll just add in here, Newcastle declared, again, Labour have held it, but Reform are second.
Well, the reports are also coming in that Grant Shapps in Wellington Hatfield, the Defence Minister, is set to lose.
Good. Failed to defend his own seat. Never mind about the country.
There you go.
So, I mean, this is really the pattern of the early part of the night here. It's actually a far more contradictory picture than the headline of a Labour majority would tell you. It's a Labour majority, but on a vote very close to the so-called disastrous vote of 2019. It's a Labour majority on a low turnout. It's a Labour majority with a big reform surge. So this is, it's not a picture where you can simply say the headline and that tells you the whole story. There's a whole series of other stories going on here as well.
And there's another seat in the northeast, Washington and Gateshead South. Labour have held it, but Reform have come second. So Labour have got...
That's practically in every seat in the northeast.
Every seat in the northeast. Yeah. And the Tories are... the Tories are down to 12.7. I mean, they've got less... The Tories got less than half of what Reform voted. So the Tory vote has collapsed.
Well, I mean, as we've already said, Rishi Sunak has said he's going on Friday. There's going to be one hell of a contest inside the Tory party. I mean, I don't know what the opposite of a beauty contest is, but that's going to be what it is in the Tory party. And it seems to me there is no possible outcome where the Tory party doesn't get a more right-wing leader than any that we've seen, including Boris Johnson, and where Farage is the prince across the water, where he is really dictating the terms on which the Tory party choose its next leader. I mean, it's a massive reconfiguration of the political right.
There is this issue in relation to what we're seeing because of the number of votes that have been coming in, and we've seen how Labour has got this kind of paper majority, like you said, a sandcastle majority, because these voters haven't gone away; they've just migrated. They've migrated to Reform or they've migrated in these different constituencies as they stand. So they haven't necessarily given tacit support to Labour itself, but they've allowed Labour to win in those particular seats because they've held back. And I think what's going to take shape is how those votes are then won again, and it comes from that, like you said, the very disturbing situation of it being more right-wing in order to bring them as one.
And I think the other thing that's ought to be said is that we're talking a lot about France. One of the things to remember about France is last year there were huge strikes over the increase in the pension, the retirement age.
That's just France, come on.
And they were defeated. They were defeated. The union leaders didn't build on them. And that defeat has fed in, the demoralisation feeds in to the National Rally's success. So we need to think about the other way around. We need to think about how we can get victories over issues which are really affecting people now. I mean, the level of poverty in this country, the dependency on food banks, child poverty, it's shocking.
Well, that's Ibrahim.
And that's an issue for the Muslim community because it's even worse, the figures.
Absolutely.
In terms of finance, in terms of those areas as well, because it's quite an important issue in terms of how Muslims are looking at finance. We have this kind of crescent pound, this kind of idea that there is this wealth within the Muslim community that's actually translating to a lot of stuff as well. How has that worked? How does that play?
So I think as a community, we need to have a real shift, frankly, in how we approach the entire country. I think we need to be thinking about, rather than thinking about, these are our issues, Muslim issues, we need to be thinking, how can we as a community actually contribute? And I think, one really easy way, not easy, but one way of tackling reform is by actually covering the reform supporters with love, right? Because this is wedge politics, where they're seeking to divide communities, and through the wedge, they win votes. But if we as a community, launch into these programs, I mean, for heaven's sake, a lot of the Muslim community is overrepresented in the NHS. If you can have these campaigns where you're actually going into reform areas and you're showing them that, this is a Muslim community, we really care about this, we're going to cut these NHS waiting, lists for free, for example, and you heal it with love, right? That actually undercuts the entire argument that reform is putting forward. And the same thing is, on the economic side. I think, of course, we as a community care about housing, just like everyone else, and we actually own far less homes as a religious group relative to any other religious group. So that's an argument that we should be making, not just for our community, but for everyone. And say, look, as a community, we've got Islamic finance, and that has an ethical basis to it, and we've got great ideas about how we can actually solve this stuff. And that helps everyone. So the basic point I'm making is, as a community, to now be politically mature, rather than saying, us, we're a minority, give us stuff. It should be, we have great ideas. We believe Islam is, a religion of peace and, a religion of truth. This is the contribution intellectually that Islam can make on the serious issues that really face everyone.
And I think you're right on that, because I think it's interesting. I mean, talking to, and I don't want to be stereotypical, but middle-aged Muslim women here over Gaza, they then start talking about the international rules-based economy. They talk about neoliberalism. And I'm sitting there thinking, where have you got this from? And there's been a repoliticization inside the Muslim community. And they're aware, I think, more increasingly aware, other sections of the population too, but I think it's particularly important in the Muslim community. They're aware of what is wrong in this country and in the whole world, the setup of the world, and the questioning. So I think you're 100% right on that.
It's agency, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting. We've had Reform UK candidates on during the course of the election, and I'm wondering, certainly one of the ones that I talked to, he wasn't really that integrated into the Reform UK policy, programme. He was uncertain about what the party said, unconfident about defending it. I wonder how stable it's going to be as an entity, because he won't be the only one that's in that condition. They've put together an electoral challenge in as short a time as some of the independents have as well.
I think there's a difference. I think the difference is that UKIP and Reform aren't exactly the same, but the UKIP have already, there's a huge overlap. I'm sure there's going to be more candidates elected who have made Islamophobic, racist statements, and that will come up. I'm sure that's going to happen. But I think there's a difference. I think because of that overlap with UKIP, they have got something on the ground here, and that is more worrying. I think they will also be moving. I mean, it's not dissimilar from the discussion we have. They will be aware they have to strengthen their grassroots organisation. You know, to win elections, you need grassroots organisations. So they will be moving that. So, you know, they'll be drawing not dissimilar lessons that we're talking about here.
Yeah. I think the other lesson we as a community, I mean, you look at the numbers, right, on this general election. The other key lesson that strategically as a community we need to learn is that in UK politics, parties win and independents typically don't win, right? That's just the data shows that. So, you know, from a perspective of sending a message, an independent could be a great vehicle to do that. But from a perspective of longer term, where are we as a community? Clearly, right, it's either going to be the Lib Dems, it's going to be the Greens, it's going to be the SNP, or it's going to be Plaid Cymru. Well, potentially, you know, could even consider Labour if they significantly move from where they are right now, or the Conservatives. But the point I'm making is that, you know, where we need to find a home for our vote as a community, that home must sit within a party. And what better party, I would say, right now than just based on the data, I've never voted for them before, is the Lib Dems, right? If you project it at about 60 odd seats, and you can get them towards 100 seats, that can be, you know, that can be a really interesting alliance.
I think you need to remember the Lib Dems record when it was in coalition with the Conservatives.
That's true.
I remember
That's also true,
they promised they won't go introduce tuition fees, and they did.
Well, it doesn't really look as if the electorate has. I mean, I think it was your phrase, Wasif, earlier on that they'd forgiven the Liberal Democrats. Well, the Liberal Democrats are certainly going to end up with more seats, but they aren't ending up with more votes. They've actually dropped 2.4%. So I would say, on that evidence, they haven't been forgiven by a large chunk of the electorate. More on the details of the turnout here. Newcastle Central, Labour vote. Labour retained it, have held Newcastle Central, but the Labour vote was down by 13%. The turnout was down by 9%. So, I mean, this is now, I think, you know, I don't think there's been a result declared. What have we got now? 6 results where that hasn't been the pattern. Labour held all of them. The turnout was down in all of them, and Reform second in 5 out of those those 6. So, you know, the pattern is going to change over the night. Not all the constituencies are like this. They're very heavily grouped actually in the northeast at the moment. But insofar as we have a pattern,
in the south, where we've got the Chancellor potentially losing his seat, that is going to be.
I mean, this is an interesting report coming in. We haven't had any results from seats with a large Muslim vote. It's saying, given the national picture, Labour is nervous in about 20 constituencies about the Muslim vote. And it names them, polls have been tight in Rochdale, but they're also worried in Birmingham, Lancashire and Bradford constituencies, as well as Luton North, Slough and Leicester South. And that's not even touching London. Now, if Labour are worried about those seats, and they were sending people in to campaign in those seats, safe Labour seats, then let's see. We haven't had the votes yet, but it indicates they're aware there is a problem here.
And that's, the crazy thing is that's 7 months worth of very mediocre campaigning from volunteers versus a Labour machine that has £35 million in funding and it's got hundreds of staffers, right? And that's the result of that. And this is without a party system. This is just independents, just very upset and very angry, who've done that.
With very little funding.
With very little funding.
Well,
can you
also,
imagine?
you can see the difference that makes. I mean, there were reports today of Labour calling out across London saying, we need more people to go up to Jeremy Corbyn's constituency because we're being run close by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, no independent has got the ability to reach out across a city like that and redirect canvassers on election day.
In Birmingham, they were having to redirect people to Jess Phillips' seat because they were worried she's going to lose it. So, I mean, Labour have got problems here. So, unfortunately, we're not going to miss the election results in the seats we're most interested in many ways. But tomorrow we'll be back at 3 p.m, I believe, so we can discuss it then.
But then there is this issue of the money as well, because it used to be like you said with Jeremy Corbyn, the £3 and there you go. That's you're a member and you have that bottom-up approach. The agency that the Muslim vote has created within itself, that's the trust is what is probably most important. We're also hearing now that, you know, these seminal issues such as Gaza, these are going to become more of an issue in terms of keeping Labour away from the Muslim vote, because I think it was only this month where you had large donations from strong Zionist supporting organisations that have gone to Labour and where they sit with Labour. That is going to have a fundamental effect in terms of trust.
I mean, further reports visiting to the north saying that Jeremy Corbyn has won narrowly by 1,500 votes. Now, I should say the way the system works is we won't have the result, but the people in the count can see the piles of votes. So as the ballot boxes are open, you get a good idea of where things are moving. So I would put some faith in the suggestions here that Jeremy Corbyn has held Islington North. That would be a result. That would be a result. That's worth staying up for.
Yeah.
You know, Labour are briefing that they think that the Reform exit poll figures are exaggerated and that they will end up with fewer than the predicted 13 seats. I mean, I suppose you might say they would say that, wouldn't they?
But not on the polls we're seeing in the actual results we're seeing in the northeast.
Yeah, indeed. So we're as you say, we've got a very, we should say this actually, we've got a very particular set of results now, very heavily concentrated in the northeast. There will be a different picture in other parts of the country. The challenges to Labour will be different. And we haven't yet had, of course, any of the significant seats that are being challenged by independents. We don't have Jeremy Corbyn's or George Galloway's results in. We don't have Leon Mohammed or Andrew Feinstein's results in yet, so we don't know how strong that challenge is either. But we do know that the Prime Minister will no longer be Prime Minister and indeed no longer be leader of the Tory party by next Friday. I mean, I haven't looked at who the challenges are likely to be, but
California.
Well, there were some members of the Tory party who were on the campaign trail in the last week, and I don't mean the campaign trail for the general election. They were on the campaign trail to be the next leader of the Tory party. Suella Braverman, very obviously. Kemi Badenoch, pretty obviously. But there'll be others.
The problem is that what you're seeing here is various people saying on social media, conservatives saying, we've got to return to conservative values, we've got to move back to our mainstream beliefs. In other words, move right. But they're not moving in an empty room.
Yeah.
Reform UK are there. Farage gets fantastic publicity.
Yeah.
He'll get even greater publicity now. It's not going to be so easy for them to recoup that. Now, Kemi Badenoch must be the front runner, and she, as I say, she's capable. That doesn't mean I won't support her. So she'd be better than Liz Truss or probably Rishi Sunak, who, from the beginning of this campaign, when he announced the election result in the pouring rain, has looked incapable. But it's not saying very much.
And also, I mean, the kind of, abstract logical solution for the right would be to unite. But I mean, even if some of the leaders of the Tory party thought that was a good idea, you can't quite see it working for Farage at the moment, can you?
No. And I think there's a class dynamic here as well. I think they look down at Farage. I think they look down at Reform. They sort of regard them as peasants who've, are in rebellion. And I think they're going to suffer for that. So, I think the Tories have got problems here. I mean, they haven't done as badly as we said at the beginning of this show as might have been expected. They haven't been decimated, but they have got problems. And for both Labour and Tory in different ways, Reform UK, if it repeats these successes in the northeast of England, they have got problems with it.
I mean, here's a radical idea. It may be mad, right?
Always the best ideas.
Don't worry, it's late.
The Tory party is down. It's been, kicked in the proverbials. Is this a potential point where the Muslim community, maybe not, publicly and vociferously, but some in the Muslim community reach out and say, look, we can potentially align with you on the socially conservative side. You need to sort out a whole bunch of other things, particularly your stance on things like Gaza. But could there be an alliance here
No.
No.
I think we're reaching.
And I think there's a reason. I think there's a fundamental reason we've touched on.
It's been a heady night.
I think Islamophobia is so rife; it would be very difficult.
The problem is exactly that, isn't it? It's the Islamophobia. I mean, what I really worry about is education. Actually, it's not. We've got the things that are there, the health service and everything else. It's the kind of policies that are being put in place of how you have to put this kind of, idea of British values and how you think about British values, and how that is going to become very, very central to education in the upcoming years, because that's also going to shape thinking and understanding of how young people approach things. And for me, that's a real concern in terms of that's going to be what comes in through the back door.
Well, I think the hope is, we have seen, as someone says, young people voting for reform, but we've seen around Gaza, young people becoming much more politicised, much more apparent. So that is the hope for, and I hope, Muslim youth, Jewish youth, I mean, of all backgrounds. I mean, it's fascinating. And the United States is even more interesting in this regard.
Agreed.
Well, like I say, there's a few more results I think are beginning to filter through. We don't have any definite additional results.
Corbyn's arrived. He's arrived at the vote count in Islington.
No, brilliant.
Yeah, which is quite early actually, because we aren't actually expecting that result through till between 3 and 4, I believe. So Jeremy must be feeling confident to want to spend that much time in the in the counting room before the result is finally known. So at the end of this week, when the Tory leadership candidates are lining up to replace Rishi Sunak, let's just go along the panel. Who do you think the favourite is, Chris?
Kemi Badenoch. I think it'd have to be the favourite. I think she's the only big hitter, I think, that's going to survive here. I mean, Jeremy Hunt looks like he's going, Grant Shapps is going. I'm beginning to run out of names who's surviving from the shadow cabinet.
Well, we've had Enoch now, and now I suppose we have Bad Enoch. That's where we're at.
Have you been waiting to make that joke?
Oh, come on, you know I have. You know I have. That was the punchline.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, give me the name of your scriptwriter.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think Suella's probably going to chuck her hat into the ring, and maybe Penny Mordaunt, but I'm not sure she's far right enough potentially to appeal to where the Tories would want to be. I think so. I think either Kemi or Suella.
Well, let's warming up to be quite a week.
Well, at least we know who's going to be Prime Minister.
Yeah, at least he's hung on in there. So we're coming towards the end of the programme now. Let's just have a quick roundup from each of our panellists here tonight. What do you make of it so far? Closing statement. What do you make of it so far? What do you think is going to come up in the hours as we move towards the full results? We'll see.
I think we're obviously going to see a Labour majority. We're going to see a Labour Party come into power. I think we're going to see a very disconnected Labour Party for the first time ever. It's going to be a very different type of Britain that we wake up to. Things are not getting better necessarily. And I think what we are going to see is a real galvanisation of civil society. I think civil society is the key issue here. That's what's going to really take a strong hold of where we go as a nation in the next 5 years.
Okay, Ibrahim.
Yeah, I think there's all of these undercurrents and these smaller stories that I think are going to be so important for us as a community, because what they speak to is the unity and the coordination and the anger and the activism that has led to these results happening within the space of 6 and 7 months. So that's where I think I take a lot of hope from. And I think that's also where I'll be focused in terms of looking at the results as they come in, because this is actually going to then define the next 3 or 4 election cycles. And for the Muslim vote, it's about the next 4 or 5 election cycles.
Okay, Chris.
I think the big story is obviously Labour's landslide, but I mean we should say that this is rather shallow. This is on a percentage vote lower than Jeremy Corbyn secured in 2017, and we're seeing. We'll see if this is repeated nationally, but it looks quite likely to be Reform coming second in safe Labour seats in the northeast of England. That is a game changer. That is going to shift British politics, I predict, to the right, and that is worrying.
Okay. Well, I think that's bringing us towards the end of our first coverage of the UK general election. We'll be back with you tomorrow afternoon when we'll have the full set of results and be able to tell a little bit more precisely what's happening. But just let me see if I can summarise for you what the results look like at this point in the evening. The Labour majority, probably 170 seats, looks secure. So the Tories have been decisively trounced at the election. It looks as if Reform is going to do better than was predicted in early polls, although some Labour commentators are saying not as well as the 13 seats that they're predicted to gain. All this, however, has so far been achieved on a lower turnout. Indeed, the turnout looks like for the Labour Party as if it's nearly as low as it was in 2019. So that brings us, I think, to the end of this coverage at the moment. So do come back to us tomorrow.
So there we have our first panel of the evening, and we've obviously discussed a number of different issues. We are now in a process, I suppose, of seeing what comes in the next 24 hours, because the vote is very, very close to coming through on the Corbyn matter. And so in that particular constituency of Islington, we're going to wait for that particular vote to come through. And hopefully we can end on that particular issue of seeing whether or not Jeremy Corbyn has been able to hold Islington. There is obviously Keir Starmer's own seat, which is in Camden. That is also going to be declared as well. So that is another one where Andrew Feinstein was standing, and we'll see how well he does in that particular seat. The story of the night really has been how Labour has obviously trounced the Tories tonight, but it's also the fact that they haven't done it in a convincing way when you look at the data itself. The first past the post system really does belie a lot of untruths, effectively, as to what the population is thinking and what the population is feeling. And as Muslims, and the Muslim vote especially, there has been a galvanization of a particular community in a particular format. And it's to see how well that particular community now corresponds and responds to
We're done, right?
what is going to be a very long and arduous 5 years, because what is to come in the next 5 years is going to be very, very difficult. The 5 years that we have is something that I really do want to pick up on as a specific issue to the Muslim community, because there will be strengthening and there will be positives that we've seen in relation to how the community has got together. But we also know that there are going to be strong challenges in relation to an increase potentially in Islamophobia, an increase in all of these areas, because these are the fears, because they're not being dealt with primarily by the parties that are there and set up to do so. We're going to keep, I think we still got our guest Ibrahim Khan, and so we want to bring him in again in relation to some of those particular points. Ibrahim, what do you think the main challenges are going to be for the next 5 years? For the Muslim community, how do you feel we're going to fare?
Yeah, so I think for the Muslim community, the key challenges are going to be first and foremost the same as it is for everyone else, but likely exacerbated. So if you think about it, there are probably three key issues, right? You've got the cost of living crisis, you've got the NHS and the huge burden on the NHS, and then you've got issues like housing, right? And unfortunately, on each of these three issues, the Muslim community is going to come off worse, disproportionately, because we're, 44% of us live in the 10% poorest constituencies. So when you think about cost of living, that's going to hit us the worst. When you think about NHS, unfortunately, we have lower life expectancies. We live in areas where the health outcomes are just worse. So the pressure on the NHS is going to hit us the most. And then housing, we as a community, as a faith group, we have the least amount of home ownership out of all the faith groups. So again, this is going to hit us the most. So I think the issues that hit all of the UK hit the Muslim community the worst. And I think the second issue that we need to think about is, we are potentially politically homeless, and we now need to think about where do we find that home? Which party is it with? And we need to navigate that pathway forward.
So we've seen how Gaza is an issue that has effectively extrapolated us from everything else, from the main political systems. It's almost kind of purged everything to leave us standing, as you say, in a kind of homeless position where we are with political parties, and we've got independents that are taking some of those particular points on board. Is there I remember you saying earlier that we might find homes with the Liberal Democrats, we might find homes with other parties. What about a specific party that has Muslim votes and Muslim ideas and concepts at the front?
Yeah, so I'm suspicious of that for two reasons. I'm not against it. I'm not ruling it out.
I'm going to just stop you right there because we have to go back to. We're going to go to Maz in Islington. Is he in Islington? Hello, Maz. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Wasif. I'm actually outside the count where Jeremy Corbyn's announcement is just about to take place. And it seems Labour sources are saying that he may just have squeezed through. And it's going to be very, very close. We're talking about around 1,500 votes, or there or thereabouts. So there's nothing to say that it's absolutely a certainty that he's going to make it through. We've seen Jeremy go into the actual centre. We've seen pictures, obviously, that come out. And it I don't know, can you judge by what Labour sources say? Sometimes they may just be trying to dampen expectations or trying to, just in case they do lose, but however, they may be secretly, privately thinking that we've actually got this. Jeremy certainly seemed to be in good spirits, so judging by people's facial expressions and the fact that he came in sort of, as his usual self, maybe he's quietly confident. But yeah, this is where we are. We've done three areas throughout the night in Redbridge, and then we've moved on to Waltham Forest and also over here. All independents are challenging in these constituencies. I think this is the one that might produce a win for one of the independents, which is Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, just as his former party takes power with a huge majority. Obviously, we're waiting for the result in Rochdale and other places as well. So we'll see where we are.
So in terms of Jeremy Corbyn, one of the things that's really interesting here is he has been a sitting MP since 1983 in that particular constituency. So he has a lot of groundswell of support in relation to people on the ground that have been able to help and assist. What has been Labour's approach generally to tackling this particular bottom-up approach that Jeremy Corbyn is bringing?
Well, let's just look at the pollsters and what they were saying. So Novara Media did a poll just a few days before the election, and what they found is that Jeremy Corbyn was actually more popular than the Labour Party. However, when they did a poll of candidates, Jeremy Corbyn was actually trailing the Labour candidate. So it'd be interesting to see what happens over there. I think this bottom-up politics that you talk about is where the smart politics is for the next generation, because we've seen the impact of technology, social media on this particular general election. Obviously, we've been covering the demonstrations because of the war in Gaza, the genocide that's been taking place. And as a result of that, so many independents have taken an active part in the elections. But can they ultimately win? In this election, it's going to be very, very difficult. To do what Reform UK did requires a lot of money, a lot of investment, a lot of organisation, and the fact that they get national attention from the media, which independents don't get. However, and this is the big if, and this is what I've been talking to people and parties in and around London, particularly, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be the same across constituencies and areas across the UK, is that the locals is where independents can certainly make an impact. We've seen it in Tower Hamlets, where an independent party called Aspire, obviously we know, but for many, many years has been having taken independent seats off Labour in the main, and then won the mayoralty and have been controlling the council now for the last number of years, even though there was a hiatus in between when Labour took control. And I think, judging by the mood in the ground, I was there on the ground in East London, particularly today, that's where independents are. They're not going to go away. That's what they're saying to me. They said they're here to stay, and that's where I think this ground up is going to work most effectively.
So really, we're saying that it's going to be local council elections that we really need to keep our eye out for as the next big shock, I suppose. Yep.
Absolutely, because you see, to win a parliamentary seat, you're talking about 15, 20, 30,000 votes even in some seats. For a council seat, it's much less. I mean, you're talking between 1,000 and 1,500, even less in certain areas, because we've seen very low turnouts, 15%, 20%, that's the average, perhaps sometimes going up to no more than, say, 25%. And there are candidates that win with 500-600 votes. Now, if you look at the campaigns that have been taking place, certainly the ones that we've covered, say, for example, in Ilford and other areas, that vote is there, the groundswell is there, but can this now be translated into local elections with the sense of unity? And that's the thing, you see, because there's been a lot of ructions within the independent movement itself, different how campaigns should be conducted, who should be leading those campaigns. It's those sorts of questions that need to be resolved if they're going to have an impact. Remember, Labour, the Tories and Lib Dems and all the other mainstream parties, and particularly in East London, which is Labour, they have an organised body, a system that actually knows, a mechanism that's been there and tested, and they've done this for many, many years. So that's the challenge.
I suppose when we're looking at this in terms of, I was going to ask our guest, please, how to go now, but is there a case to say that there should be a Muslim party?
Well, I mean, far be it for me to answer that question. Traditionally, there was an Islamic Party of Britain. I mean, we're talking about 2-3 decades ago, and it didn't do well at all. In fact, it died a death, and even the founder, I don't think, is alive any longer. But could a religious party work? I think the problem we have with any religious party is that it appeals to one particular segment. Where we are, Muslims are a minority, a very small minority. That 5%, 4% is what some people say. And as a result of that, you've got to unite with other sort of movements that whose agenda you can tag onto. Many Muslims still, even now, despite Gaza, feel that they want to be with the Labour Party. And we've seen that in this election. They've been campaigning with Labour candidates up and down the country, despite the views, the strong views of their constituents that, hold on, this is not what should be happening. So it's all to tell what will happen. I mean, the next generation, the young generation, is, I think, where the smart money should be. What are they going to do? A lot of them didn't vote in this election, perhaps disenchanted with what happened in Gaza, thinking all politicians are the same. Can you engage them enough to get them out to vote? Perhaps with the types of candidates that we've seen, you can do that, but all should be revealed, and I think things will change. The Muslim population is due to double in number over the next decade or so, and I think then it will become a serious force. But right now, whether to have a Muslim party, I'm not so sure, Wasif, whether that's going to be happening anytime soon.
I mean, the consolidation of Muslim wealth is probably one of the important factors as well that has taken shape, because it isn't just a case that everyone is just a working class Muslim, and that's what it was. It was like Muslim and then working class was the adage that you put onto it. That isn't the case. There is a strong middle class that is emerged in relation to Muslim population. So the demographics and the change of that demographics, how has that played out?
Yes, absolutely. I think in a lot of these independent campaigns, there has been financial backing. There's been small donations, large donations from across the board, and I think a lot of the community, in terms of the segments that you say, those that have done really well, those who are sort of doing well and are aspiring to do well, they've come into the fore and they've become political. When I've been covering the demonstrations in central London, it's incredible to see those who are there are very, very articulate, very, very passionate, know the issues and know the subject matter really, really well. And it isn't just somebody at a mosque saying you need to be at a demonstration on a Saturday because they said so or the religious leader said so. No, they will only be there because they've studied the facts, they know what's going on. And I think social media, again, I'll mention that again, has a huge impact on this. Now, what happens with that smart money? Where did that smart money go? I know there have been significant donations to political parties, the major political parties. The Lib Dems have received a few million from Muslims. We know Reform UK received £1 million from a Sri Lankan heritage Muslim. And the Labour Party obviously has Muslim financial backers, so do the Tories. So I think to say the Muslim community is a monolith, it's one body that acts in unison, that's certainly not the case. I mean, I met today, as I said, many Muslims who were still supporting Labour on a national level, despite what happened in Gaza. Not the majority, by far from it. I mean, I've met many who are absolutely furious with the Labour Party, but as we've seen with the results, and let's see what happens in Birmingham, places like Blackburn and other places. What happens with those votes in that community? Or, we'll analyse that tomorrow, and I'll obviously be on the show after 3. Yeah. There's a plug for the show. We'll see if you don't mind me saying to analyse those results.
Okay, Maz, thank you so much for your time. You've been out there in the cold. We know that you've done an absolutely sterling job running around London. That's all we've got time for tonight. A lot of people are saying we'll be back tomorrow. Well, actually, no, we'll be back a little bit later on today, just a little bit later in the day. But thank you so much for joining us. And we wake up tomorrow to a new government, clearly. Thank you.